At exactly 5:45 in the morning, the heavy rhythmic pounding on my front door vibrated through the floorboards and settled right in my joints. I didn't have to check the clock. At 73 years old, you don't sleep deep enough to miss the sound of authority. I pulled on my robe, adjusted my glasses, and opened the door to find Sheriff Miller standing there. He was a man I had seen at the local diner for 20 years, but today his eyes wouldn't meet mine. He held a stack of papers that felt heavier than they looked. Outside, the neighborhood was still draped in that gray pre-dawn light. But across the street, sitting on the hood of their gleaming white Lexus, were my son Kendrick and his wife Sloan. Sloan was leaning back, her blonde hair catching the first hint of sun, a smirk plastered on her face like she had just won the lottery. Kendrick was looking at his shoes, but even from 40 feet away I could see the twitch in his jaw. They weren't just watching. They were savoring the moment. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat and handed me the eviction notice. He told me I had 2 hours to gather my essentials and vacate the premises. He sounded like a man reading a death sentence to a friend. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I took the papers, scanned the signatures, and looked him straight in the eye. I asked him one simple question. "Officer, before I even think about stepping off this porch, tell me something. Did the judge who signed this order happen to mention the ongoing federal RICO investigation currently flagged on this exact property title?" The color drained from the sheriff's face so fast I thought he might faint right there on my welcome mat. His hand began to tremble as he reached back for the papers. He looked at the watermark on the back, then at the seal, and suddenly the air in the neighborhood got very, very cold. Before I tell you how a retired IRS auditor like me turned a simple eviction into a federal nightmare for his own blood, I want to know where you are watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if you have ever been underestimated by people who thought your age made you weak, hit that like button and subscribe. This story didn't start with a knock at the door. It started 4 weeks ago in a room that still smells like my late wife Lorraine. I was cleaning out the back guest closet, a task I had been avoiding since her funeral. Sloan had been over the day before, claiming she wanted to help, but mostly she just hovered eyeing Lorraine's vintage jewelry. She had left her designer trench coat draped over a chair, and when I went to move it, a folded piece of stationery fell out of the pocket. Now I spent 35 years as a forensic auditor for the IRS. I don't just read papers, I dissect them. It was a formal bank notice from a group called Apex Financial LLC. It wasn't addressed to me, but the collateral listed on the second page made my heart skip a beat. It was the legal description of my house, my home. The house my father helped me build with his own hands back in the 60s. The notice mentioned a $3 million business line of credit that was 30 days past due. I sat on the edge of the bed, the paper crinkling in my hand. Sloan was a high-level credit officer at a private bank. She knew the language of debt better than she knew the Bible. I looked at that name again. Apex Financial LLC. It sounded like every shell company I had ever hunted down in a tax evasion case. I didn't say anything when they came back for the coat. I watched them. I watched how Sloan touched the crown molding in the hallway, her fingers tracing the wood like she already owned it. I watched how Kendrick couldn't look me in the eye when I asked him how work was going. That night, after the house was silent, I sat down at my computer. My eyes aren't what they used to be, but my fingers still know their way around a public records portal. I logged into the Cook County Deed Registry. I expected to see my name, Terrence Vance, listed as the sole owner. Instead, I found a transfer deed filed 3 months prior. It showed that I had supposedly sold the property to Apex Financial for the sum of $10 and other valuable considerations. I zoomed in on the signature at the bottom of the page. It was a masterpiece of a forgery. To the untrained eye, it was my handwriting. The way the T in Terrence hooked at the top, the slight slant of the last name. But I noticed the hesitation, a tiny ink bloat at the start of the V where the person had paused to check their work. My own son had sat at a table, likely coached by his wife, and wiped away my entire legacy with a few strokes of a pen. They thought I was just an old man who spent his days watching the news and tending to his roses. They thought the digital world was a foreign language to me. They didn't realize that I was the man who once found a $50 million hidden account because of a missing comma in a spreadsheet. I felt a heat rising in my chest that I haven't felt in decades. It wasn't just anger. It was a cold, calculated clarity. I didn't call the police. I didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. If I moved too fast, Sloan would use her connections to bury the trail. I needed her to think she was winning. I needed her to be so confident that she would walk right into the trap I was about to set. I went back to the kitchen, made myself a cup of black coffee, and stared out the window at the empty street. I realized then that blood doesn't make you family. It just makes you a relative. Loyalty is what makes you family. and my son had traded his loyalty for a woman who saw people as nothing more than assets to be liquidated. I stayed up until the sun rose, not out of fear, but out of preparation. I started a new file on my desktop. I named it The Apex Project. As I sat there, I remembered the day Kendrick was born. I remembered the pride I felt thinking I was building something to leave behind for him. Now I realized I wasn't just protecting a house. I was protecting the dignity of every man who has worked his whole life only to have the people he loves try to shove him into a corner and take what's left. The next morning I saw Sloan pulling into the driveway. She had that bright fake smile on her face, the one she used right before she asked for a favor. She brought over a box of pastries, telling me I looked tired, and maybe I should think about a smaller place somewhere with a staff to take care of the heavy lifting. I took a bite of a croissant, smiled back at her, and told her she was absolutely right. I told her that I was thinking about making some big changes to my estate. The look of greed that flashed in her eyes was almost pathetic. She didn't even realize that she had just confirmed every suspicion I had. She thought the hunt was over. She didn't know that the real game was only beginning, and she was playing against a man who knew exactly where all the bodies were buried in the financial world. I let her talk, I let her plan, and all the while I was counting every lie she told like I was balancing a ledger. The debt was growing, and I was going to make sure the interest was more than she could ever afford to pay. I walked down the 3 steps of my porch and didn't look back at the white Lexus across the street. I could feel Sloane's eyes burning a hole in the back of my head, and I knew she was probably recording me on her phone, hoping I would stumble or show some sign of the frailty she was counting on. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a limp or a sigh. I kept my back straight and my head held high as I climbed into my old Cadillac. The engine turned over with a low growl that felt like my own heartbeat. I drove away from the house I had lived in for 50 years and headed straight for the First National branch on 79th Street. The drive was only 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. I passed the park where I used to take Kendrick to play t-ball and the old bakery where Lorraine used to buy her Sunday rolls. Everything looked the same, but the world felt tilted. I pulled into the bank parking lot and saw Big Al, the security guard, standing by the door. He was a man about my age, and we had shared many nods over the years. Usually he would crack a joke about the weather or ask how my garden was coming along. Today he just looked at me with a strange expression. It wasn't anger, it was something worse. It was the kind of look you give a man who is standing on the edge of a cliff and doesn't know it yet. I walked into the lobby and the cool air-conditioned air hit me like a slap. The bank had that familiar smell of old paper and industrial carpet cleaner. I walked up to the teller window where Maria was working. Maria was a sweet girl who had been working there for 5 years. She usually had a smile ready for me and a peppermint candy she would slip over the counter. But when she saw me approaching, her face went pale. She looked at her computer screen and then she looked at me and her hands started to shake. I pulled out my wallet and pushed my debit card across the marble counter. I told her I needed to make a significant withdrawal. I wanted $5,000 in large bills. I needed that cash to put a retainer on a lawyer who understood how to fight a dirty war. Maria didn't touch the card. She didn't even look at it. She just stared at the screen and whispered that she was so sorry. She said the system wouldn't let her process the request. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I asked her if there was a problem with the machine. I told her I knew exactly what was in that account because I had checked the balance only 48 hours ago. She didn't answer me. Instead, she reached for the phone and whispered into the receiver. A moment later, the door to the manager's office opened and Mr. Henderson stepped out. He was a man who tried to look important in a suit that was a size too small. He had been the manager there for a decade, and we had always been on good terms. But as he walked toward me, he wasn't smiling. He had his hands clasped in front of him in a way that signaled bad news. He asked me to come into his office. I followed him, and as the heavy wooden door shut behind us, the silence of the room felt like a weight. He didn't offer me a seat. He didn't offer me water. He just stood behind his desk and pulled a thick manila folder from his drawer. He told me that he had received a legal directive from the head office. He said that my daughter-in-law Sloan had provided the bank with a series of notarized documents. My heart began to drum against my ribs. I knew Sloan was ambitious, but I hadn't realized how deep her reach went. Henderson opened the folder and slid a document across the desk toward me. It was a medical power of attorney and a temporary guardianship order. The words on the page were a direct assault on my soul. Sloan had filed a declaration claiming that I was suffering from advanced dementia. She had provided reports from a private clinic I had never even visited. The documents claimed that I was experiencing paranoid delusions and was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. It said that I was a flight risk and that I had been showing signs of aggressive behavior toward my family. It was a total character assassination. She had used her position as a high-level credit officer to verify the urgency of the matter, claiming that I was at risk of liquidating my entire estate, due to a mental break. Because she had provided the right codes and the right medical signatures, the bank had frozen every cent I owned. My pension check, which had been my lifeline since I retired from the IRS, was now being rerouted to a trust account controlled by her and Kendrick. My savings and my emergency funds were all under lock and key. Henderson looked at me with a look of pure pity. He told me that until a court-appointed evaluator could prove otherwise, his hands were tied. He said he was truly sorry, but the bank had to protect the interests of their clients. I looked at the man and I realized he believed the papers. He saw a confused old man instead of the forensic auditor who used to make billionaires sweat. I didn't argue with him. I had spent 35 years looking at ledgers, and I knew that once a system has been programmed to see you as a liability, words won't change the outcome. You don't scream at a locked vault. You find a different way to open it. I picked up my card and walked out of his office. I made sure to keep my face neutral. I didn't want to give them any evidence of the aggression Sloan had described. I walked past Big Al and Maria and out into the sweltering Chicago heat. I felt like a ghost in my own life. Everything I had built and every dollar I had earned was being treated as if it belonged to a child who couldn't be trusted with a nickel. Sloan was good. She had moved fast, and she had hit me where it hurt the most. She thought that by taking my money, she was taking my power. She thought an old man without a bank account was a man without a weapon. But she had made one critical mistake. She thought I was like her. She thought I lived entirely within the digital world of credit scores and direct deposits. She forgot that I grew up in a house where we didn't trust anything we couldn't touch. My father had lived through the Depression, and he had taught me a lesson that I had never forgotten. He told me to always keep a shadow ledger and a physical reserve. I drove back to my house. The white Lexus was gone and the street was quiet. I let myself in through the back door and walked into the library. This room was my sanctuary. It was filled with the smell of old leather and the memories of late nights spent working on complex cases. I moved the heavy oak desk aside and pulled back the corner of the oriental rug. I used a flathead screwdriver to pry up a loose floorboard that looked exactly like all the others. Tucked inside a waterproof metal box was $10,000 in emergency cash. I had been adding to this pile for 20 years just in case of a rainy day. I never thought the rain would come from inside my own family. I sat on the floor with the money in my lap. $10,000 wasn't enough to buy a new house, but it was enough to buy information. It was enough to fund a counterinsurgency. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like an auditor again. The adrenaline was huming through my veins and my mind was racing through the files I had seen in Sloane's coat and on her laptop. She was running a fraud ring and she was using my house as the centerpiece. She needed me out of the way so she could complete the final transfer before the cartel realized the collateral was being watched by the government. I took $1,000 and put it in my pocket. I left the house and drove to a small independent electronics shop in a part of town where the neon signs are cracked and nobody asks for an ID. The shop was owned by a guy who looked like he hadn't seen the sun in a decade. He was surrounded by stacks of gutted motherboards and rolls of copper wire. I didn't waste time with small talk. I told him I needed a burner phone with a prepaid data plan and 2 of the smallest high-frequency microphones he had in stock. I wanted the kind that could transmit to a remote cloud server so the evidence wouldn't be lost if the devices were found. The clerk looked at me and nodded. He didn't care why a 73-year-old man needed spy gear. He just cared about the cash. I paid him and walked out with a small brown paper bag. When I got back to the car, I sat in the driver's seat and took a long, deep breath. I felt the weight of the burner phone in my hand. It was a tool of the trade. Sloan thought she was the one holding the remote control to my life. She thought she had successfully framed me as a man who had lost his mind. But I was about to show her that a forensic auditor never loses his mind. We just wait for the numbers to stop adding up. I went back into my house and began to work. I planted the first microphone in the underside of the dining room table where they usually sat to discuss their plans. I put the second one in the light fixture in the entryway. I knew they would be coming back soon. They would be coming to check on their demented father and to see if the pressure from the bank had broken me. They wanted me to crawl. They wanted me to beg for a spot in a managed care facility. I sat in my armchair in the dark and waited. I wasn't an old man waiting for the end. I was a hunter, waiting for the prey to walk into the clearing. The game had changed, and for the first time in weeks, I was the one who knew the rules. Sloan and Kendrick had started a war they didn't understand. They thought they were stealing a house, but they were actually walking into an audit. And in my world, an audit always ends with someone paying the price. The silence in my house was always the heaviest just before the sun went down. I sat in the darkness of the library, listening to the house settle and the floorboards groan like old bones. I had the burner phone in my pocket, and the microphones were already live and feeding into the cloud server. I was ready. When the headlights finally swept across the living room wall, I did not flinch. I had been expecting them. They did not call and they did not text because they wanted to catch me off guard. They wanted to see me in a state of disarray. They wanted to find me sitting in the dark so they could use it as evidence of my declining mental state. I heard the heavy clatter of their footsteps on the porch. The door swung open and the light from the hallway flooded in. Kendrick and Sloan walked in like they were the masters of the house and I was just a tenant they were tolerating. Sloan was carrying 2 large bags from a high-end Italian bistro, and the smell of garlic and expensive herbs filled the room. It was an aggressive smell designed to mask the tension in the air. Kendrick followed her with a chilled bottle of Chardonnay. He looked pale, and his hands were trembling slightly as he set the bottle on the kitchen island. Sloan did not wait for an invitation. She started pulling out white porcelain plates and fine silverware. She looked at me with a bright, fake smile that did not reach her eyes. She told me that they had been worried about me and that they wanted to have a nice family dinner to smooth things over. She called it a fresh start. She said that family should always come first and that she was sorry for how things had been handled at the bank. I watched her every move. My training as a forensic auditor had taught me that people only offer a gift when they are trying to hide a debt. I stayed quiet. I sat at the head of the table where I had sat for 50 years and I let them play their parts. Sloan was moving with a frantic kind of energy. She was talking about her day and a new project at the bank, but she kept glancing at me to see if I was buying the act. Kendrick sat to my left. He could not even look at the salt shaker without flinching. He was a shell of the man I thought I raised. He was so terrified of his own shadow that he had let this woman lead him into a den of thieves. Sloan poured the wine. She was careful about it. She stood with her back to me for a moment, and I saw her shoulder dip in a very specific way. She was reaching for something in the pocket of her designer slacks. When she turned around, she had 2 glasses of wine. She walked over and set a full glass right in front of me. She told me it was a special reserve from a boutique vineyard and that it was exactly what I needed to relax. She said a good night of sleep would do wonders for my clarity. I looked down at the pale yellow liquid and I felt a chill run down my spine. Most people would have just seen a refreshing drink, but I had spent 35 years looking for the things people tried to hide in the cracks of spreadsheets and the margins of contracts. I knew how to look for what was not supposed to be there. I noticed a faint, milky swirl at the very bottom of the glass. It was a subtle cloudiness that had not fully dissolved into the alcohol. And there on the rim near the stem was a tiny speck of white powder. It was no larger than a grain of salt, but to me it was as loud as a gunshot. She was trying to drug me. She probably had a high dose of a heavy sedative or an antipsychotic mixed in there. If I drank that glass, I would be unconscious within 15 minutes. And while I was out, they would probably call an ambulance and tell the paramedics that I had suffered a mental breakdown or a suicide attempt. By the time I woke up, I would be strapped to a bed in a psych ward, and Sloan would have full legal control over everything I owned. I felt a surge of cold fury, but I kept my face as still as a statue. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of knowing I had caught them. I needed to turn the tables. I needed to show her that she was playing a game with a master of the craft. I waited until Sloan sat down and picked up her own glass. She was watching me with an intensity that she could not quite mask. I began to cough. I made it sound deep and wet, like I was struggling for air. I reached for my chest and gasped for breath. Sloan leaned forward with a look of feigned concern, but I could see the anticipation in her eyes. I purposely knocked my heavy linen napkin off my lap and let it flutter to the floor. As I bent down to retrieve it, I used the bulk of my shoulders and the edge of the table to block her line of sight. In one smooth motion, I swapped my glass with hers. It was a move I had rehearsed in my mind 1,000 times while I was sitting in the dark earlier. When I sat back up, I took a shallow sip of the wine from the glass she thought was hers. I told her I was fine and that it was just a bit of dust in the air. Sloan smiled. It was a predatory, satisfied smile. She thought the trap had snapped shut. She picked up the glass in front of her and took a long, deep drink. She said she was glad I was feeling better and that we should all just focus on the future. She started talking about the house again and how much work it needed. She said she had already talked to a contractor about some renovations. She was talking about my home as if I was already dead and gone. I just nodded and ate a piece of bread. I watched the clock on the wall. I knew the chemistry of sedatives. If she had used what I thought she used, the onset would be rapid. The change happened so fast it was almost comical. Within 3 minutes, Sloan's words began to trip over each other. Her voice lost its sharp edge and became thick and heavy. She tried to reach for her fork, but her hand moved in a slow, clumsy arc and she missed the plate entirely. Her eyelids began to droop and she started to sway in her chair like a tree in a high wind. Kendrick noticed it first. He stopped talking about the weather and stared at her with his mouth open. He asked her if she was feeling okay, but she could not even form a coherent sound. Her head rolled back against the high-backed chair and her wine glass slipped from her numb fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. Sloane groaned once and then she was out. She slumped forward and Kendrick barely caught her before she hit the table. He was panicked. He was screaming her name and shaking her shoulders, but she was dead to the world. He looked at me with pure terror in his eyes. He asked me what was wrong with her. He asked if she was having a stroke. I stayed in my chair and looked at him with a level of calm that clearly terrified him even more. I told him that she probably just worked too hard and that the stress of the day had finally caught up with her. I suggested that he should get her to the emergency room immediately before things got worse. I told him he should not waste time calling an ambulance because every second counted. Kendrick did not even think to question me. He was so consumed by his own fear that he reverted to being a helpless child. He scooped her up in his arms and struggled toward the front door. He was so frantic that he left his car keys on the counter and her designer bag sitting on the sofa. I heard him fumbling with the door and then I heard him running across the porch. A moment later, the car engine roared to life and the tires screeched as he sped away from the curb. I sat in the silence of the dining room for a long minute. The smell of the Italian food was still strong, but the predatory energy was gone. I stood up and walked over to the sofa. Sloane's work laptop was tucked inside her bag. It was a high-end machine with corporate encryption, but I knew that she was arrogant enough to keep her login credentials saved on a physical key in her bag. I grabbed the bag and the laptop and headed straight for my library. I had a digital forensic kit that I had kept updated over the years, and I had the cloning software ready to go. I did not have much time. I knew that once they got to the hospital, the doctors would run a toxicology report, and Sloane would eventually wake up. But for now, I had a window of opportunity. I sat at my desk and opened the machine. I was not just looking for personal emails. I was looking for the Apex financial architecture. I wanted the server logs and the transaction histories that linked her private bank to the shell companies. I wanted the digital fingerprints of the forged deed. As the progress bar on my cloning software began to crawl across the screen, I felt a sense of cold professional satisfaction. Sloane thought she was the one who understood the modern world of finance. She thought I was a dinosaur waiting for extinction. But she forgot that a dinosaur is still a predator, and a forensic auditor does not need a gun to destroy a life. We just need the data. I watched the files transferring, and I knew that by the time the sun came up, I would have enough evidence to bury her and anyone else involved in this scheme. Kendrick had chosen his side, and now he was going to have to live with the consequences of following a wolf into a trap. I sat in the dark library, the blue light from the monitor reflecting in my glasses, and I waited for the truth to finish downloading. I was 73 years old, and I had never felt more alive. The hunt was on, and this time I was the one holding all the cards. The house was finally silent again, and the air seemed to clear as soon as Kendrick's car disappeared around the corner. I did not waste a single second. I walked straight to my library and locked the door behind me. I sat down at my desk and pulled the cloned drive out of my pocket. It felt cool and heavy like a piece of lead that held the weight of my entire life. I plugged it into my dedicated system, the one I had built myself with triple-layer encryption and no connection to the outside world. I did not need a fancy laboratory or a team of experts. I just needed the silence and the cold logic of an auditor. The blue light of the monitor reflected in my glasses, and for the first time in years I felt that old familiar hum in my blood. It was the feeling of being on the trail of a predator. The computer fan began to whir, a low, steady sound that filled the empty spaces of the library. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a muscle memory that age could not touch. I had spent 35 years looking at the things people tried to hide in the shadows of balance sheets. I knew that criminals always leave a footprint, and the more arrogant they are, the deeper the mark they leave. Sloane was brilliant in her own mind, but she was a victim of her own ego. She thought she was too smart to be caught, and she thought I was too old to look. That was her first mistake. I bypassed the initial security layers easily. Corporate encryption is often like a massive steel door with a cheap lock if you know where to apply the pressure. I did not bother with her personal folders or her photos. I did not care about her travel plans or her social life. I wanted the architecture of the lie. I went straight for the hidden directories and the system logs. I found what I was looking for buried in a subfolder labeled as obsolete archives. It was a masterpiece of deception. I opened a series of massive spreadsheets and my eyes narrowed as I began to scan the rows. Most people see numbers as abstract symbols, but to me they are a language. They tell a story of where a person has been and where they are desperately trying to go. What I saw on that screen was a story of a monster hiding in plain sight. It was a massive synthetic identity fraud ring. I watched as the columns revealed a list of over 500 social security numbers. I recognized the patterns immediately. These were the numbers of foster children who had not yet entered the workforce, and elderly people who had recently passed away in state facilities. Sloan was taking these clean numbers and mixing them with fake names and fabricated employment histories. She was building ghost people. These were not just stolen identities. They were carefully crafted personas with perfect credit scores and high-limit credit cards. She was using her position at the bank to verify these ghosts and bypass the automated fraud detection systems. It was a digital factory that turned thin air into cold, hard cash. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the scale of the operation. This was not a side hustle. This was an industrial-grade criminal enterprise. As I scrolled further, I found the primary node of the network, Apex Financial LLC. It was a shell company registered in a tax haven, but the physical address for its operations was right here. It was my house. My home was the registered headquarters for a fraud ring that had processed tens of millions of dollars in the last 18 months alone. She had used my property to give her ghost company a sense of legitimacy. She had turned my sanctuary into a criminal fortress without me ever knowing. Then I found the document that made my hands shake. It was a loan agreement for $3 million. Sloan had not just forged the deed to my house to steal the equity. She had used the property as primary collateral for a massive private line of credit. She had leveraged every brick and every shingle I had worked for to get her hands on $3 million in liquid cash. But the money was already gone. I tracked the outbound transfers to a series of encrypted wallets and offshore accounts. She was draining the company dry and preparing to disappear. I looked at the lender listed on the agreement, Blackwood Capital. My stomach did a slow turn. I had heard that name during my final years at the IRS. They were not a legitimate investment firm. They were a front for one of the most ruthless cartels operating on the South Side. They did not use lawyers to collect on their debts. They used men with heavy boots and cold hearts. Sloan had taken $3 million from people who do not accept excuses. The spreadsheets showed that the loan was already 30 days past due. The interest was compounding at a rate that was designed to be impossible to repay. This was the reason for the rush. This was the reason for the drugging and the eviction and the fake dementia papers. Sloan was being squeezed by the cartel, and she was trying to use me as a human shield. She had Kendrick convinced that they were just moving into a bigger house, but in reality, she was setting him up to be the one standing in the line of fire when the debt collectors arrived. If the loan defaulted, the cartel would not care about the legal deed or the court orders. They would simply come to the house to collect their collateral or the equivalent value in blood. Kendrick was the one who had signed the secondary guarantor papers. I saw his signature on the screen, and it looked so small and weak compared to the cold legal language of the contract. His own wife had handed him a death sentence, and he had signed it with a smile on his face. She had made sure that all the criminal liability and the financial risk rested on him, while she held the keys to the offshore accounts. I sat back in my chair and stared at the monitor. The blue light felt like it was burning into my eyes. I thought about Kendrick as a boy, and how I used to tell him that a man is only as good as his word and his work. I had tried to give him a foundation of integrity, but he had chosen a foundation of sand. Now the tide was coming in, and it was full of sharks. My son was not just a traitor. He was a sacrifice. Sloan had planned this from the very beginning. She had targeted me because she thought I was a soft target, and she had used Kendrick because he was easy to manipulate. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 3 a.m. I had the data, but data alone was not enough to stop the cartel. I needed to act before the morning sun hit the pavement. The information on this drive was enough to send Sloan to prison for the rest of her life, but prison would not protect me or the house from Blackwood Capital. I needed to move the pieces on the board in a way that Sloan could never anticipate. She was playing a game of speed, but I was going to play a game of consequence. I began to copy the most incriminating files onto separate encrypted drives. I created 3 identical sets. One for the FBI, one for my old contacts at the IRS, and one for a very specific person I knew who understood how the cartels operated. I felt a strange sense of peace. The confusion and the hurt of the last few weeks were gone. They had been replaced by the cold precision of a forensic auditor who had found the missing variable. The variable was Sloan's arrogance. She thought she was the smartest person in the room, but she had forgotten that I had spent my entire career in rooms filled with people exactly like her. I closed the laptop and placed it back in her bag. I made sure every cable and every paper was exactly where I had found it. I wiped my fingerprints from the casing and walked back to the dining room. I looked at the broken wine glass on the floor. It was a fitting symbol for what our family had become, something beautiful that had been shattered by poison. I did not feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a judge. I was going to let Sloane believe her plan was still working. I was going to let her think she was the one in control right up until the moment the floor fell out from under her. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. Somewhere out there, Kendrick was sitting in a hospital waiting room praying for a woman who would not hesitate to step over his body to get to a suitcase full of cash. It was a tragedy, but I could not save him yet. I had to save the legacy first. I had to save the house that my father had helped me build. I had to save the honor of the Vance name. I went back to my library and picked up the burner phone. I had a phone call to make to a man I had not spoken to in a decade. A man who owed me a favor from a time when the world was a much simpler place. The audit was entering its final phase, and this time the results were going to be public. Sloane and Kendrick had invited a wolf into their home, but they were about to find out that the old man they tried to bury was the one who had been hunting wolves his entire life. I took a sip of cold water and pressed the call button. It was time to settle the books. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked with a rhythmic precision that usually brought me comfort, but tonight it felt like a countdown. At exactly 12:14 in the morning, the silence of my home was not just broken, it was obliterated. The sound began as a sharp, high-pitched explosion of glass, followed by a heavy, sickening thud that echoed through the downstairs hallway. I sat perfectly still in the darkness of the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I did not move toward the light switch. I did not cry out. I stayed low, my breath shallow and controlled, just as I had been taught decades ago in a jungle thousands of miles from Chicago. I waited for the second sound, the sound of a footstep or a door being forced, but there was only the whistle of the cold night wind rushing through the jagged hole where my living room window used to be. I gave it 5 full minutes before I stood up. I moved through the shadows with a grace that most people would not expect from a 73-year-old man. I navigated the familiar turns of my hallway by touch alone. When I reached the living room, the moonlight was reflecting off 1,000 tiny shards of glass scattered across the oriental rug like diamonds. In the center of the room lay a standard red clay brick, the kind used to build half the bungalows on the south side. It looked heavy and out of place on the floor Lorraine had spent years polishing. Taped to the rough surface of the brick was a folded piece of yellow construction paper. I knelt down, my knees popping in the quiet room, and peeled the paper away. I didn't need to turn on the lamp to know what it said, but I pulled the small high-intensity flashlight from my robe pocket anyway. The beam of light was narrow and sharp. The words were written in thick, black permanent marker, blocky and impersonal. It said, "Pay the $3 million or the old man dies first." There was no signature. There was no return address. There was only the cold finality of a business ultimatum. This was not the work of a random vandal or a neighborhood kid looking for trouble. This was a message from Blackwood Capital. This was the cartel coming to collect on the debt Sloane had built, using my life as collateral. I stood there in the middle of my ruined living room, the cold air biting at my skin, and I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me. I realized in that moment that my home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage for a sacrifice. I looked at the hole in the window and I didn't see a broken pane of glass. I saw a breach in the ledger. I saw exactly how Sloane had calculated her exit strategy. She knew the cartel was coming. She knew the loan was in default, and she had purposefully directed their attention toward me. She had made sure they knew exactly where the old man lived and exactly how much he meant to the man who had signed the papers. I walked back to the library and opened the tall mahogany cabinet in the corner. Tucked behind a row of heavy accounting textbooks was a long, narrow case. I pulled it out and laid it on the desk. Inside was my Remington 870 shotgun, a weapon my father had given me when I first moved into this neighborhood. It was a relic of a different era, but I had kept it clean and well-oiled for 50 years. I reached into the box of shells and pulled out 2 rounds of double-aught buckshot. I slid them into the magazine tube, and then I racked the slide. The sound was a heavy mechanical double-click that felt like a period at the end of a sentence. It was a sound of finality. It was the sound of a man who was no longer waiting to be a victim. I sat down in my leather chair, the shotgun resting across my lap, and I began to audit the situation in my mind. Sloane was brilliant, but she was predictable. She had set me up to be the primary target because it served 2 purposes for her. First, it acted as an early warning system. If the cartel moved against me, she would know exactly how much time she had left to move the money and disappear. Second, it provided her with the ultimate leverage over Kendrick. She could tell him that his father was in danger and use that fear to keep him compliant, to keep him signing whatever documents she put in front of him until the very last second. My own son was a pawn in a game he didn't even realize he was playing. Kendrick was so desperate to prove he could be a success, so desperate to live the life Sloan had promised him that he had become a co-conspirator in his own destruction. He didn't understand that to Sloan he was just another synthetic identity, a ghost she could discard once the account was drained. She was using my house, my life, and my son's name as a human shield while she prepared to fly away with $3 million of cartel money. It was a perfect cold-blooded scheme, and it would have worked if she hadn't tried it on a man who knew how to find the missing variable in every equation. I realized that I couldn't fight the cartel with a shotgun alone. You can't shoot a debt, and you can't kill a criminal enterprise one brick at a time. I needed to move the fight into a different arena. I needed to move it into the world of federal jurisdiction, a place where Sloan's bank connections and the cartel's street power meant nothing. I put the shotgun aside for a moment and opened my computer. I pulled up the burner phone and synced the audio files I had recorded from the dinner. I listened to Sloan's voice thick with the sedatives I had given her, and I felt a cold satisfaction. I had her fingerprints on the laptop, her voice on the recordings, and her digital trail on the cloned drive. I opened a new document and began to draft an anonymous whistleblower file. I titled it, The Apex Project Summary. I didn't write it like a victim. I wrote it like the forensic auditor I was. I laid out the facts in clear clinical detail. Subject: Apex Financial, LLC. Primary violations: synthetic identity fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering in excess of $20 million. I listed the social security numbers she had stolen. I listed the offshore accounts I had tracked. I detailed the forged deed to my property and the illegal loan from Blackwood Capital. I made sure to include the specific bank routing numbers that Sloan had used to move the funds. I knew the exact people to send this to. My old contacts at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division were men who didn't care about family drama or neighborhood politics. They cared about the numbers. They cared about the high-level players who thought they were above the tax code. I spent the next 3 hours refining the file, attaching the digital evidence I had harvested from Sloan's machine. I was building a cage out of data, a cage that would eventually trap everyone involved in this mess. As I worked, I kept the shotgun within reach. I knew that the brick through the window was just the beginning. The cartel had issued an ultimatum, and when the deadline passed, they would come back with more than just a piece of masonry. They would come with fire, and they would come with steel. But they were expecting an old man who was paralyzed by fear. They were expecting a man who would beg his son to pay the debt. They were not expecting a man who was turning his home into a federal crime scene. I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest when I thought about Kendrick. I wanted to believe that he didn't know the full extent of what Sloan was doing, but the audit didn't care about intentions. It only cared about the signatures. Kendrick had signed the papers. He had stood across the street and laughed while I was being evicted. He had chosen his side. I realized that to save the house and to save myself, I might have to destroy the only son I had left. It was a heavy price, but Lorraine always told me that the truth doesn't come cheap. I finished the draft and encrypted the file. I set it to be delivered to Agent Miller's private server at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. Before I sent it, I added one final note at the bottom. It said the property at 42 South Street is the center of this operation. If you want the leaders, follow the deed. I was officially making my home a honeypot. I was inviting the federal government into the middle of my living room. It was a dangerous move, but it was the only one that led to a checkmate. I walked back to the broken window and looked out at the street. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, casting long, thin shadows across the pavement. The neighborhood was waking up, but my world had already changed forever. I picked up the brick and set it on the coffee table. It would be my first piece of evidence. I sat back down in my chair, the shotgun across my lap and the burner phone in my hand. I was ready for the next move. The cartel wanted their $3 million and Sloan wanted her freedom, but I was the one holding the ledger. And in my experience, the auditor always has the last word. I watched the sunrise and waited for the world to start its day, knowing that by nightfall the house of cards Sloan had built would begin to tumble down. I felt old and I felt tired, but most of all I felt like Terrence Vance again. The hunt was no longer in the shadows. It was right here on my front porch. I sat at my desk and stared at the burner phone until the screen timed out. I knew that once I made this call there would be no going back. I was not just defending my house anymore. I was initiating a federal case. I pulled up a number from a memory I had kept locked away for 10 years. Agent David Miller. Back in the day, we were the two most hated men in the Treasury Department. We did not care about politics or making friends. We only cared about the trail of the money. I pressed the call button and listened to the line click and hiss. It took 4 rings before a voice answered. It was a voice that sounded like gravel and dry leaves. Miller did not say hello. He just waited. I did not say my name. I just said I have a synthetic identity ring with a $3 million cartel link and a forged deed in the middle of it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Miller shifting in his chair and the sound of a pencil scratching on a notepad. He recognized my voice immediately. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask about Kendrick or Lorraine. He knew that if I was calling him after a decade, it was not for a social visit. He asked me for a primary entity name. I said Apex Financial LLC. I heard the sound of keys clacking as he ran the name through the internal database. He grunted and said the name was flagged as a low-level shell, but nothing was moving on it. I told him he was looking at the wrong ledger. I told him he needed to look at the private lending side and the medical power of attorney filings. I explained the situation in under 3 minutes. I kept it clinical. I did not talk about the broken window or the sedatives or the betrayal. I spoke the language of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I talked about wire fraud and the RICO predicates. I told him I had a clone of a senior credit officer's laptop and that the transaction logs were already sitting on my server. Miller breathed out a long, slow whistle. He said if what I was saying was true, this was bigger than a neighborhood scam. This was a multi-state operation. But then his voice got serious. He told me that his hands were tied by the bureaucracy. He said he could not just launch a raid because an old friend called. He needed a formal entry point. He needed a way to jump the fence without alerting the bank or the cartel street teams. I told him that was exactly why I was calling. I was not asking for a favor. I was offering him a lead. I told him I was ready to file a formal whistleblower complaint under the Taxpayer First Act. I told him I wanted my property at 42 South Street to be designated as the primary site of investigation. I saw his plan before he even voiced it. He asked if I was willing to stay in the house while it was under federal surveillance. I told him I was not going anywhere. This house was my father's legacy, and I would see it burn to the ground before I let a cartel foot soldier or a crooked daughter-in-law take it. We talked for another 20 minutes about the technicalities. No long reunions, no catching up, just the cold, hard business of taking down a predator. We ended the call with a plan to meet at a neutral location to sign the paperwork. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a nondescript sedan parked in the back of a grocery store lot. Miller looked older, but his eyes were still as sharp as a hawk. He handed me a tablet with a digital signature pad. He told me that once I signed, I was officially a confidential informant and a protected whistleblower. I pressed my finger to the glass and watched the status change to active. Miller explained the legal shield he was putting over my head. He was registering my home into the Federal Whistleblower Asset Protection Program. It was a specific legal mechanism designed for high-value witnesses whose primary assets were being targeted for seizure or intimidation. This was the setup that Sloan would never see coming. By law, the moment my property was registered in this program, any attempt to seize it or foreclose on it, or even enter it without federal authorization, became a direct violation of federal law. My house was no longer just a building. It was a federal honeypot. It was a trap designed to catch anyone who tried to execute a civil order on it. Sloan thought she had a valid eviction notice signed by a corrupt local judge. But a federal whistleblower protection order overrides a local civil court every single time. The moment that sheriff or a cartel enforcer stepped onto my lawn, they would be committing a federal felony. Miller told me that the FBI would be setting up a remote monitoring station a few blocks away. They would have high-definition cameras on my street, and they would be intercepting every signal coming in and out of the Apex financial servers. He told me that the cartel was likely monitoring my movements, but that his team would be invisible. He warned me that I was essentially acting as live bait. He said that if Sloan felt the walls closing in, she might act out of desperation. I told him that Sloan was already acting out of desperation. She was drugged and confused, and she was losing control of the timeline. She needed my house to satisfy the cartel debt, and she needed it now. I drove back to my neighborhood and pulled into my driveway. I looked at the broken window and the brick sitting on the coffee table. I felt a strange sense of power. I was not just an old man with a shotgun anymore. I was a part of a federal machine. I walked through the house, and I could almost feel the change in the air. This place was built by my father's hands. He had poured the concrete and laid the bricks with a pride that did not know the word failure. He used to tell me that a man's home is the only place in the world where he is truly free. Sloan had tried to turn that freedom into a cage. She had tried to use the very walls that protected me to bury me. But now the walls were a trap for her. I imagined her looking at her spreadsheets and her forged documents, thinking she was 3 steps ahead. She thought the local sheriff was her ultimate weapon. She thought her bank connections made her untouchable. She had no idea that she was walking into a RICO case that would dismantle her entire life. I sat in my library and looked at the clock. The countdown was still running, but now I was the one who controlled the tempo. I was the 73-year-old man that they thought was a relic. I was the victim they thought they could exploit. But in reality, I was the one who had just turned their entire world into a crime scene. I knew that Kendrick would be the one to suffer the most. He was my blood, but he had forgotten the lessons of this house. He had traded his father for a woman who treated people like entries on a balance sheet. He was going to learn the hard way that an audit does not just find the money, it finds the truth. I spent the rest of the night preparing. I did not sleep. I just sat in the dark and listened to the hum of the house. I knew that the next knock on the door would be the beginning of the end. I was the honeypot, and the predators were hungry. But they did not realize that the man inside the house had been hunting predators for a very long time. I was ready for the morning. I was ready for the fight. And most of all, I was ready to see the look on Sloane's face when she realized that her $3 million plan had just become a 30-year sentence. I looked at the burner phone one last time before I tucked it away. Everything was in place. The numbers were lined up and the trail was set. Sloane and Kendrick were about to walk into an audit that they could never survive. I walked back to the kitchen and made myself a final cup of coffee. The sun was just starting to peek over the buildings across the street. The neighborhood was quiet, but I knew that the storm was coming. I was the one who had invited it, and I was the only one who knew how to weather it. I sat at my kitchen table and waited for the world to wake up. The final stage of the project was about to begin, and I was ready to see it through to the end. The audit was officially open. The sun was high, and the neighborhood was deceptively peaceful when I saw the white Lexus turn the corner and pull up to the curb with a violent jerk. Sloane was out of the car before the engine even stopped. She looked different. The polished corporate predator I had seen at dinner was gone, replaced by something jagged and desperate. Her hair was a mess, and her eyes were bloodshot from whatever sedatives had been in her system. She marched toward the front door, and I could hear her heels clicking like a countdown on the concrete. I stood in the library, and I did not move. I had placed her bag and the laptop exactly where I found them, but I knew a woman like her would notice the invisible shifts in the universe. She burst through the door without knocking. She didn't look at me. She went straight for the sofa and grabbed her bag. I watched from the doorway as she pulled out the laptop. She didn't turn it on. She ran her fingers over the casing, and then she looked at the zipper of the bag. She looked at me, and the hatred in her eyes was so cold it felt like a physical weight in the room. She knew. She didn't know exactly what I had taken, but she knew the seal had been broken. She knew the dinosaur had been inside her cage. She didn't scream at first. She just stood there breathing hard. The air in the house seemed to vibrate with her panic. I realized that she wasn't just angry, she was terrified. If I had the data, then her entire world was about to collapse. She needed to discredit me before I could speak. She needed to turn me into a criminal before the federal agents turned her into a prisoner. She walked out onto the porch, and that is when the performance began. She started shouting my name. She started screaming about how I had stolen her property and how I was losing my mind. She was loud enough for the neighbors 3 doors down to hear. I walked to the screen door and looked at her. I told her to go home and call her lawyer. I told her the audit was already finished. That was the spark that set the fire. Sloane looked around the yard and saw a large, jagged limestone rock near my flower bed. She didn't hesitate. She picked it up, and I watched in horror as she raised it and slammed it into her own cheekbone. The sound of the impact was sickening, a dull, wet thud that I will never forget. She didn't stop there. She scraped the rock against her forearm until the skin broke and the blood began to bead up. She dropped the rock and collapsed onto the porch steps wailing. It was a terrifying display of commitment. She was willing to destroy her own body to ensure I was destroyed. She lay there on the steps of the house I built, and she let out a shriek that sounded like a wounded animal. I stood behind the screen door, paralyzed by the sheer cold-blooded nature of the act. She wasn't a human being in that moment. She was a machine calculating the shortest path to my ruin. The police sirens were audible within minutes. Sloane had clearly called them before she even got out of the car, or she had someone on speed dial. 2 patrol cars pulled up, and then I saw Kendrick's car swerve in behind them. He must have been following her, or she had summoned him to witness her masterpiece. The officers jumped out with their hands on their holsters. They saw Sloane huddled on the steps, her face swelling and purple blood dripping from her arm. They saw me standing behind the screen door, calm and untouched. The optics were exactly what she wanted. A battered young woman and an old man with a history of alleged dementia and aggression. One of the officers, a younger man with a buzz cut, yelled for me to step out with my hands visible. I did exactly what they asked. I didn't want to give them any reason to use force. I walked out and felt the heat of the sun on my face. Sloane was a fountain of fake tears. She pointed at me and her voice was a trembling mess of fear. She told them that I had lured her back to the house to return her bag, and then I had snapped. She said I hit her with the rock and tried to drag her inside. She told them about the dementia and how she had been trying to get me help, but I had become violent. Kendrick was standing by his car, his face a mask of absolute horror and disgust. He didn't look at Sloane with suspicion. He looked at me as if I were a monster he didn't recognize. He walked over to her and wrapped his arms around her, and the look he gave me over her shoulder was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. It was a look of pure loathing. He told the officers that I had always been stubborn, but he never thought I would sink this low. He told them I was a danger to myself and everyone else. He asked how I could do this to her. The officer with the buzz cut didn't ask for my version of the story. He didn't care about the 3 decades I had spent serving the government or the fact that I didn't have a single scratch on my hands or my clothes. He just turned me around and clicked the handcuffs onto my wrists. The metal was cold, and the ratcheting sound felt like the closing of a tomb. I didn't resist. I didn't say a word. I knew that every syllable I spoke would be twisted into a sign of instability. As they led me toward the patrol car, I looked at Sloane. She was buried in Kendrick's chest, but she tilted her head just enough for me to see her eyes. There were no tears in them now. There was only a sharp needlepoint of victory. She thought she had won. She thought the physical evidence of her own blood was enough to override any numbers I had found. She didn't know about the burner phone in my pocket or the cameras I had tucked into the eaves of the porch. She didn't know that she had just recorded her own confession in high definition. As the door of the police car slammed shut and the world turned into a blur of blue and red lights, I felt a strange sense of detachment. I watched my son Kendrick tenderly helping the woman who had just lied to the police. I watched him help her into his car, his eyes full of a misplaced protective rage. He thought he was being a hero, but he was just acting as a supporting character in a fraud. I realized then that the hardest part of the audit wasn't finding the fraud. It was watching the person you raised cheer for your arrest. I sat in the back of the car and waited for the next phase to begin. The ride to the precinct was silent, and the air in the back of the car smelled of stale coffee and plastic. I closed my eyes and visualized the data I had cloned. I focused on the truth because the truth was the only thing Sloane couldn't forge. I thought about Lorraine. I thought about how she used to say that some people are born with a hole in their soul that they try to fill with other people's lives. Sloane had that hole. She saw my house and my history, and she wanted to consume it. And my son was helping her. He was standing there on the sidewalk watching his father be treated like a common criminal, and he didn't even hesitate. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask if I needed my medicine. He just looked at me with that cold disgust. That was the real crime. The forged deed was just paper. The stolen money was just numbers. But the look on my son's face was a theft of something that could never be replaced. I sat in the precinct cell for hours. The walls were painted a dull institutional green and the light was too bright. I could hear the sounds of the station, the distant ringing of phones and the low murmur of voices. I knew the procedure. I knew Sloane was probably at the hospital getting her injuries documented and Kendrick was by her side. They were building their case, but they were building it on a foundation of sand. I kept my hands folded in my lap and I didn't speak to the guards. I waited for my one phone call. I knew exactly who I was going to call, and it wasn't a lawyer. It was Agent Miller. He was the only person who understood that the bruises on Sloane's face were nothing compared to the evidence on that cloned drive. The game was far from over. It was just getting interesting. I sat on the hard bench and I felt a strange sense of peace. I was 73 years old and I was in a jail cell, but I was the only person in this city who knew exactly how this story was going to end. The audit was moving into the discovery phase and soon everyone would see what I saw. I wasn't just an old man in handcuffs. I was a man waiting for the inevitable logic of justice to catch up with a lie. I thought about my father and the house he helped me build. I thought about the sweat and the pride in every brick. Sloane and Kendrick had tried to take it, but they didn't understand that a house built on truth can never be stolen by a lie. I took a deep breath of the stale station air and I waited. The numbers were on my side and the numbers never lie. The interrogation room was exactly how I remembered them from my days of consulting on high-level white-collar crime cases. It was a sterile box designed to make a man feel small and forgotten. I sat on a cold metal chair that had been bolted to the floor, and the harsh fluorescent lights above me hummed with a low, persistent buzz that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. I didn't look at the two-way mirror because I knew there was no point in looking at a reflection of a lie. I kept my hands folded on the scratched metal table, and I focused on my breathing. I was 73 years old and I was sitting in a police precinct while my son was probably comforting the woman who had just tried to destroy me. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. I had spent my life hunting people who hid behind numbers, and now I was being hunted by someone who hid behind bruises. The door opened and a man walked in. He looked like he had been on the force for a long time. His name tag said Detective Harris, and his suit looked like it had been slept in more than once. He didn't say a word at first. He just threw a thick manila folder onto the table with a heavy thud that sounded like a gavel. He sat down across from me and leaned in until I could see the tired lines around his eyes and the faint smell of old coffee on his breath. He told me that I was in a lot of trouble. He said that Sloan had been taken to the hospital with a possible fractured cheekbone and a laceration that required stitches. He said that Kendrick had given a detailed statement about my history of mental instability and my recent outbursts of anger. Harris told me that elder abuse was a priority for the department, but that when the elderly person was the aggressor, the law didn't show much mercy. He started to describe the charges they were looking at. He talked about aggravated battery and domestic violence. He said that because of Sloan's claims about my dementia, they were also looking into a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. He told me that if I went to a state facility, I would never see the outside of a locked ward again. He was trying to rattle me. He was using the standard interrogation playbook, trying to make the walls feel like they were closing in. He told me that my son was heartbroken, and that Kendrick had asked the police to make sure I got the help I needed. That was the phrase they used, the help I needed. It was a polite way of saying they wanted to lock me away so they could have my house. Harris said that I should just confess and make it easier on everyone. He said that if I admitted to having a blackout or a moment of confusion, they might be able to get me into a private clinic instead of a prison cell. I listened to him without blinking. I had been in rooms with men who had stolen millions, and I had seen every trick in the book. Harris was good, but he was working with bad data. He didn't realize that he was dealing with a man who had been trained to spot a forgery from across the room. I told him that he was doing his job, but that he was being played. I told him that Sloan was not a victim and that Kendrick was not a witness. I told him that I was the one who had been assaulted, but that the weapon wasn't a rock. The weapon was a lie. Harris laughed, and it was a dry sound that had no humor in it. He said that they had the physical evidence. He said that a woman doesn't just smash her own face with a rock to win an argument. He told me that I was a pathetic old man who couldn't handle his own decline. He said that by the time he was done with me, I wouldn't have a house or a penny to my name. I waited for the room to fall silent again. I waited for him to finish his coffee and for the clock on the wall to tick away another minute of my life. Then I reached into the hidden pocket of my robe. It was a small pocket tucked into the lining, and the officers who had patted me down had missed it because they were too busy looking at Sloan's blood. I pulled out the burner phone. Harris reacted instantly. He stood up and reached for his holster, but I didn't move. I simply laid the phone on the table and slid it toward him. I told him that he was about to see the most honest thing he had seen in his entire career. I told him to watch the video from the very beginning. He picked up the phone with a look of pure skepticism. He pressed play and the screen showed the high-definition footage from the camera I had hidden in the eaves of the porch. It was clear and sharp, and it captured everything. Harris watched as Sloan pulled up in the Lexus. He watched as she marched onto the porch and screamed at the empty air. And then he watched the moment that changed everything. He saw Sloan pick up the limestone rock from the flower bed. He saw the cold, calculated look on her face as she raised it and slammed it into her own cheekbone. He saw her scrape her arm until the blood ran down her skin. He saw her drop the rock and collapse onto the steps to wait for the sirens. The video had no sound, but the visual was a masterpiece of self-destruction. The silence in the room became absolute. Harris watched the video 3 times. I saw the aggression drain out of him. I saw the shock take hold. He looked at the phone, and then he looked at me, and then he looked back at the phone. He didn't say a word for a long time. He just sat there while the blue light from the screen reflected in his eyes. He realized that he had almost sent an innocent man to a cage based on the performance of a sociopath. He reached across the table and unlocked my handcuffs. The metal felt cold as it clicked open, and the weight fell away from my wrists. He told me that he had been a cop for 15 years and he had seen a lot of desperate people, but he had never seen anyone do that to themselves. He said that I was free to go and that the charges would be dropped immediately. But then his expression darkened, and he told me that there was a problem. He said that while the criminal charges were being cleared, the initial police report had already triggered a chain of events in the civil court. Sloan had used the news of my arrest to contact the judge who had signed the emergency eviction order. She told the judge that I had become violent and that she was in fear for her life. The judge had expedited the process. Harris told me that even though I was cleared of the assault, the eviction was still a legal order that had been processed through the sheriff's office. He said that by the time I got back to the house, the sheriff would likely be there to enforce the lockout. The civil law was a separate beast, and it moved with a momentum that a video couldn't stop in an hour. I stood up and straightened my robe. I felt a sharp pang of reality hit me. Sloane was still moving. She had used the time I spent in the precinct to finish her move on the house. She had used the lie to buy herself the final few hours she needed to secure the property for the cartel. Harris looked at me with genuine pity. He said that he would do what he could to update the report, but that the sheriff's department wouldn't get the update in time to stop the eviction today. He said that I would probably find my locks changed and my belongings on the curb. He told me that the law was a blunt instrument, and sometimes it hit the wrong people even when the truth was right in front of them. I thanked him for the help and I took my phone back. I walked out of the precinct and into the afternoon sun. I felt the heat on my skin and I felt the weight of the task ahead of me. I saw Kendrick's car pulling away from the curb and I knew he was heading back to the house to witness the final act. He was going to stand there and watch his father be thrown out of his own home. He was going to cheer for a woman who had just mutilated herself to win a game. I didn't feel fear and I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, professional resolve. Sloane had used a local lie to speed up a local clock, but she didn't realize that I was playing on a federal timeline. I got into my Cadillac and started the engine. I knew that the next hour would be the hardest of my life. I was going to pull up to my home and see the sheriff with the papers in his hand. I was going to see Sloane and Kendrick laughing across the street. But I also knew that I was the one who held the watermark. I was the one who had invited the FBI into the ledger. Sloane thought she was the master of the shortcut, but she was about to find out that there are no shortcuts when you are dealing with a federal audit. I drove toward my house, focused on the road and the truth. The audit was moving into the final confrontation, and I was the only one who knew that the house of cards was about to fall. I looked at the burner phone in the passenger seat, and I felt the presence of Lorraine and my father with me. I was 73 years old, and I was fighting for my life, but I knew that as long as I had the truth, I was never going to be alone. I turned onto my street and saw the flashing lights of the sheriff's car. The end was beginning, and I was ready to ask my question. While I sat in the profound silence of my library, surrounded by the ghosts of my past and the cold light of my monitors, my son was discovering the true jagged edge of the world he had tried to join. The cartel does not send emails, and they do not file lawsuits. They send messages written in pain and delivered in the dark. According to the data feeds I was monitoring through Agent Miller's encrypted link, Kendrick's car was intercepted just after 11 o'clock that night in a desolate, grease-stained parking lot behind a shuttered strip mall near the industrial harbor. A black SUV with windows as dark as obsidian had been shadowing them for miles, a silent predator waiting for the right moment to strike. When Kendrick finally pulled over at a lonely convenience store, the SUV accelerated and blocked him in with a violent screech of tires before he could even turn off the ignition. 3 men stepped out of the vehicle. They were not wearing masks. Their power came from the fact that they were invisible to the law, but omnipresent to the people who owed them. They didn't start with a conversation. As Kendrick scrambled out of the driver's seat, his hands shaking and his voice high and thin with fear, the first blow caught him squarely in the solar plexus. The sound was a sickening, hollow thud that I could almost feel in my own chest. Kendrick fell onto the cold asphalt, gasping for air that wouldn't come. He was not a man built for the street. He was a man of soft fabrics and temperature-controlled offices. He curled into a ball, a defensive instinct that did nothing to stop the heavy work boots from finding his ribs and his kidneys. They hit him with a professional efficiency, making sure every strike was calculated to maximize the pain without causing immediate unconsciousness. One of the men, a tall figure with a jagged scar through his left eyebrow that caught the flickering neon light of the store sign, reached down and grabbed Kendrick by his hair. He forced my son's face up toward the dark, empty street, making him witness his own humiliation. Kendrick didn't scream. He didn't have the breath for it. He just made a small, pathetic, whimpering sound that broke my heart, even as it fueled my resolve. The man spoke in a low, conversational tone that was far more terrifying than any shout. He told Kendrick that Blackwood Capital was officially out of patience. He explained that the $3 million Sloane had borrowed was not a suggestion or a business risk they were willing to absorb. It was a debt anchored by a property that was currently being held hostage by an old man who refused to die. He gave Kendrick a very specific ultimatum that left no room for interpretation. You have exactly 48 hours to secure that property and turn over the deed in its final unencumbered form. If that house is not in our possession by Thursday morning, we will stop looking for the money and we will start looking for you. He made it clear that they would not come back for a discussion. They would come back to liquidate the only assets Kendrick and Sloane had left, and he was not referring to the Lexus or the jewelry. He was talking about their lives. They tossed Kendrick back against the side of his car like he was a bag of discarded laundry. Sloane sat in the passenger seat the entire time. She did not call the police. She did not scream for help. She sat perfectly still behind the tinted glass, her face a mask of cold observation, as if she were watching a movie she had already seen a dozen times before. When the SUV finally sped away, leaving Kendrick shivering and bleeding on the pavement, Sloane did not immediately rush to his side. She waited for the dust to settle before she stepped out of the car. When she finally reached him, she did not offer a hand to help him up. She looked down at him with an expression that was closer to annoyance than pity. But as they climbed back into the car, her demeanor shifted with a terrifying speed. She saw Kendrick's broken spirit as an opportunity. As he sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, Sloane leaned in close. She didn't offer him comfort. She offered him a target for his rage. She whispered into his ear with a voice that was as smooth as silk and as sharp as a razor. She told him that this was all my fault. She said that if I hadn't been so stubborn, if I had just accepted the reality of my condition and moved into the facility she had chosen, none of this would be happening. She convinced him that I was the one who had invited the cartel's violence into their lives by resisting her plan for my care. She told him that I was a selfish, delusional old man who cared more about a pile of bricks and a dusty history than his own son's safety. It was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation. She took a man who had just been shattered by fear and gave him a way to feel powerful again by hating his own father. Kendrick believed every word she said because the alternative was too painful to face. He couldn't accept that the woman he loved had led him into a lion's den, so he chose to believe that his father was the true villain of the story. Sloane knew the 48-hour clock was ticking, and she could no longer rely on the slow grinding wheels of the legitimate legal system. She needed a shortcut, and she knew exactly where to buy one. She reached into her bag and pulled out a separate phone, a device she used for the high-level bank clients who didn't want their transactions on the public record. She called a man named Judge Harrison. I knew the name well. During my years at the IRS, Harrison's name had appeared in the margins of a dozen different corruption investigations, always just out of reach of a formal indictment. He was a man who lived a lifestyle that far exceeded his judicial salary, a man with a taste for expensive imports and private gambling clubs. Sloane did not waste time with pleasantries. She spoke to the judge like she was ordering a meal. She told him she needed an emergency 24-hour lockout order for the property at 42 South Street. She claimed that the situation had escalated to extreme physical danger and that I was a threat to myself and the community. She didn't provide evidence. She provided a promise. She told him that a significant contribution to his upcoming re-election campaign would be processed through the Apex financial accounts by the time the sun rose. By the time Kendrick pulled their car into their driveway, the order was already being drafted in a private study miles away. Sloane had successfully bypassed the entire civil legal system of the state of Illinois using a bribe and a lie. She looked at Kendrick as he sat in the dark, his face swollen and his hand pressed against his aching ribs. She told him to be ready at dawn. She told him that the sheriff would be there with the papers and that by noon the house would finally be theirs. She told him they were doing this to protect him, to save their future from my madness. Kendrick just sat there, his eyes glazed and his head nodding in a slow, rhythmic trance. He didn't realize that the future she was talking about didn't include a broken man who could no longer serve her purposes. He didn't realize that he was being used as the final sacrifice to clear the path for her escape with the stolen millions. I sat in my library and listened to the recordings of their conversation, the audio crystal clear through the cloud server. I felt a deep, hollow ache for the boy Kendrick used to be, the boy who used to help me weed the garden and tell me he wanted to be a builder just like his grandfather. That boy was gone, buried under layers of greed and the desperate need for approval from a woman who had no soul. In his place was a man who was willing to let a corrupt judge and a predatory wife destroy his own father to save his own skin. The pressure had reached its boiling point, and I knew that the morning would bring the final explosion. Sloane thought she had secured the winning move with her bribe and her emergency order. She thought she had outplayed the system and the cartel and the old man. But she didn't know that every dollar she moved through the Apex accounts was being logged in real time by Agent Miller's team. She didn't know that the federal honeypot was already active. Every move she made to accelerate the eviction was just another link in the chain that would eventually bind her. I stood up from my desk, my bones aching but my mind sharper than it had been in years. I walked to the window and looked out at the moon, which was hanging low and pale over the neighborhood. I knew that tomorrow would be the day the ledger was finally balanced. I knew that I would have to stand on my porch and face my son as a stranger. I would have to watch the sheriff arrive with the papers she had bought. But I also knew the secret that Sloane and Kendrick had forgotten in their rush for wealth. You can buy a judge and you can forge a signature, but you can never escape the gravity of the truth once the audit begins. The house felt quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the sunrise. I checked the shotgun one last time and placed it back in its case. I didn't need it for what was coming. I had something far more powerful than buckshot. I had the numbers, and the numbers never lie. I sat back down in my chair and prepared myself for the knock at the door that I knew was only a few hours away. The audit was entering its final, most dangerous phase, and I was the only one who knew how the final balance would look. I chose a diner on the edge of the city where the coffee is strong and the questions are few. Agent Miller was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall. He had not changed much in a decade. He still had that tired look in his eyes, like he had seen every way a human being could lie and was just waiting for the next one. I sat down across from him and did not bother looking at the menu. The waitress came by and filled my cup with black coffee, and I felt the heat through the thick ceramic. We did not talk about the old days. We did not talk about how my son had turned into a stranger. Miller just looked at the small silver drive I placed on the table between us. I told him that everything he needed was right there. I told him it was all indexed and categorized. I had done the work for him. I had mapped out the synthetic identity ring, the offshore accounts, and the direct links to Blackwood Capital. I explained that Sloan was the architect, but Apex Financial was the foundation. Miller picked up the drive and turned it over in his hands. He said that if this held up, it would be the biggest RICO case the district had seen in years. I told him it was not a question of if it held up. I told him I had double-checked every entry and verified every transaction. I reminded him that I was a forensic auditor for 35 years, and I do not give people data I cannot prove in court. He nodded and tucked the drive into his jacket pocket. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I did not want a reward, and I did not want a headline. I told him I wanted my house back, and I wanted the wolves out of my neighborhood. I told him that Sloan was planning to execute the eviction order today. She was using a bribed judge and a local sheriff to take the property so she could hand it over to the cartel to pay off her debt. Miller looked at me with a grim expression. He said that once they opened the file, the clock would start ticking. He said they could not just stop the eviction because that would tip her off. We needed her to complete the crime. We needed her to take the property so the federal charges would be undeniable. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I knew what that meant. It meant I had to let the sheriff knock on my door. It meant I had to let Kendrick and Sloan think they had won. Miller asked me if I was ready for that. I looked out the window at the gray morning light and I thought about the house my father built. I thought about the blood and the sweat in those bricks. I told him I was ready. I told him that an audit is only successful if you follow it all the way to the final balance. We finished our coffee in silence. I felt a strange sense of peace. The data was out of my hands and in the system. The trap was set, and all I had to do was wait for the predator to step into the light. Miller stood up and shook his hand. He told me to keep my phone on and to stay inside until the agents arrived. I watched him walk out, and I knew that my life would never be the same. But I also knew that for the first time in weeks, I was not just a victim. I was the one who had written the script for the end of Sloan's empire. The agreement was simple, but it carried the weight of a mountain. Miller explained that the FBI and the IRS task force would be in position by 9 o'clock. They were not going to stop the eviction process because that was the bait. He said that under federal law, the moment Sloan officially claimed ownership of the property, through the fraudulent deed and the illegal eviction, she would be committing a final act of wire fraud and money laundering in a federal jurisdiction. That was the moment they needed. They were going to let her walk right into the center of the honeypot. The plan was for them to wait until the sheriff completed the lockout. The second Sloan signed the final paperwork at her bank firm to finalize the asset transfer, the raid would begin. They were going to hit her office and her home simultaneously. Miller warned me that Kendrick would be caught in the middle. He said that since Kendrick had signed the guarantor papers and the medical power of attorney, he was legally an accomplice. He asked me if I understood what that meant for my son. I felt a sharp pain in my heart, but I did not let my voice shake. I told him that I had tried to save Kendrick. I had tried to give him a chance to do the right thing, but he had chosen to stand with the woman who was destroying our family. I told Miller that an audit does not have a heart and it does not have a soul. It only has the truth. If Kendrick was a part of the fraud, then he would have to face the audit just like everyone else. Miller looked at me with a respect that felt like a heavy burden. He said that we would stay in contact through the burner phone. He told me that the sheriff would arrive at dawn. I was to play the part of the confused and defeated old man. I was to let them see exactly what they expected to see. I had to be the victim so they could be the criminals. I walked out of the diner and the air was cold and crisp. I felt a sense of finality as I drove back to my house. Everything I had worked for and everyone I had loved was coming down to this one day. I knew that by tonight, Sloan would be in a federal holding cell and Kendrick would be facing a life of ruin. It was a tragedy that I had spent my whole life trying to avoid, but it was a tragedy that they had authored themselves. I pulled into my driveway and looked at the house. It looked so peaceful in the early morning light. The broken window was a reminder of the violence that was already here. I went inside and made one last sweep of the library. I made sure the microphones were live and that the server was transmitting. I checked the watermark on the federal protection papers one last time. It was a small red seal that held the power of the United States government. To most people, it was just a mark, but to me, it was the shield that would protect my father's legacy. I sat in my armchair and waited. I was not afraid. I was focused. I thought about Lorraine and what she would say if she were here. She would tell me that I was doing the right thing. She would tell me that the truth is always worth the cost, even when the cost is your own blood. I watched the clock tick toward 5:45. I heard the sound of the tires on the gravel. I heard the car door slam. I knew it was the sheriff. I knew Sloan and Kendrick were right behind him. I took a deep breath and prepared to walk onto the porch. The audit was entering its final phase and the balance was about to be struck. Sloan thought she was the one who was taking the house, but she did not realize that she was just walking into a cage. I stood up and straightened my robe. I felt 73 years of history in my bones, but I felt like a young man again. The hunt was over and the reckoning was here. I walked to the door and prepared for the final knock. The night air was thin and bitingly cold as I sat in the shadows of my library listening to the house breathe. I did not have the lights on because I wanted to see the world outside without being seen myself. The boards I had nailed over the broken living room window groaned under the pressure of the wind, and the smell of raw wood mixed with the lingering scent of Lorraine's lavender sachets. It was nearly 2 in the morning when I heard the familiar metallic click of a key in the back door lock. I did not reach for my shotgun. I knew that rhythm. I knew the weight of that footstep. It was my son Kendrick. He was moving with a frantic, stumbling pace that told me he was not here for a peaceful conversation. He didn't call out my name and he didn't knock. He moved through the kitchen like a thief in the home where he had taken his first steps. I stood in the doorway of the library as he entered the hall, and the pale moonlight through the clerestory windows caught the ruin of his face. He looked like a man who had been put through a meat grinder. His left eye was swollen shut, a dark, bulbous grape of bruised skin. His lip was split, and a crust of dried blood traced a line down his chin. He was hunched over, clutching his side as if every breath was a jagged piece of glass cutting into his lungs. He saw me standing there, and he didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask if I was okay after the arrest or the assault. He just leaned against the wall and let out a long, wheezing breath that smelled of copper and fear. He started talking before I could even open my mouth. His voice was a high-pitched, frantic whisper that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. He told me that I had to leave. He said that time had run out and that the people Sloan had borrowed money from were done with waiting. He told me about the parking lot and the SUV and the boots that had broken his ribs. He said they were coming for the house at dawn, and if I was still here, they would burn the place down with all of us inside. He didn't apologize for the forgery or the medical papers. He didn't apologize for standing across the street and laughing while the sheriff handed me an eviction notice. Instead, he pleaded with me to be reasonable for once in my life. He told me that my stubbornness was going to get him and Sloan killed. He called me selfish for holding on to a house that was already lost. He said that the deed was signed and the money was spent, and there was no point in fighting a war that was already over. He begged me to just take my suitcase and go to the motel he had booked for me. He promised that once the cartel was paid off and the house was sold, he would take care of me. He said he was doing this for my own good. It was the same lie Sloan had used, but coming from my own son, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. He was crying now, the tears mixing with the blood on his face, and he looked so small and broken that for a fleeting second I felt a spark of that old fatherly pity. I wanted to reach out and tell him that it was going to be okay. I wanted to tell him that I had a plan to save him. But then he reached out his hand to steady himself on the banister, and the moonlight hit the gold band on his ring finger. My heart stopped. It was not his wedding ring. It was Lorraine's antique wedding ring, the one my father had bought with his first 3 months of wages from the factory. I had given it to Kendrick years ago, telling him to save it for the woman he truly loved. I had expected to see it on Sloan's hand, but there it was on his finger. I looked closer and saw the jagged scratches on the gold and the way the setting was bent. Kendrick saw me looking and he pulled his hand away, but it was too late. He admitted that Sloan had suggested they use it as a show of good faith to the cartel enforcer during the beating. She told him that giving up a family heirloom would prove they were serious about paying the debt. My son had taken his mother's most precious possession, the symbol of 42 years of honest love, and handed it over as a bribe to a group of murderers. In that moment, every remaining spark of pity in my soul was extinguished. The audit was complete, and the balance was zero. Kendrick was no longer the boy I had raised. He was a stranger who had traded his mother's memory for 48 hours of borrowed time. I looked at him, and I didn't see a son. I saw a liability. I saw a man who had chosen a predator over his own blood and a lie over the truth. The silence that followed was absolute. Kendrick was still whimpering about the cartel and the urgency of the morning, but his voice sounded like it was coming from miles away. I realized that the house was no longer a home for both of us. It was a fortress for me and a trap for him. I stood up straight, and the weight of 73 years felt as light as a feather. I had been trying to find a way to shield him from the fallout of the IRS sting, but I saw now that the fallout was exactly what he deserved. He had participated in every step of the betrayal, and he had finished it by desecrating the memory of the woman who had loved him most. I looked him in the eye, and my voice was as cold as a winter morning in the South Side. I told him he was right. I told him that I was tired of fighting and that I didn't want to see anyone else get hurt. I said that I would gather my things and be out of the house before the sun touched the trees. Kendrick's face transformed. He looked relieved, as if he had just been granted a stay of execution. He started thanking me, telling me that I was doing the right thing for the family. He said he would stay in the guest room for a few hours to rest, and then he would help me load the car. I told him that wouldn't be necessary. I told him to go to sleep and that I would handle everything myself. He turned and hobbled up the stairs, his footsteps heavy and uneven, and I watched him go with a heart that felt like it had been turned to stone. I went back into the library and picked up the burner phone. I sent a single message to Agent Miller. The target is in the house. The timeline is unchanged. Proceed at dawn. I then walked through the house one last time. I touched the walls and the door frames, feeling the history of the Vance family beneath my fingertips. I was not leaving. I was preparing. I went to the basement and retrieved a small suitcase I had packed days ago. It didn't contain clothes. It contained the original deeds, the forensic reports, and the birth certificates. It was the only evidence of my life that mattered. I set the suitcase by the front door, and then I sat back down in my armchair to wait. The countdown was in its final hours. Kendrick was upstairs dreaming of a freedom that would never come. Sloane was somewhere else, probably checking her offshore accounts and preparing to run. And I was here in the center of the honeypot waiting for the predators to arrive. I looked at the boarded-up window, and I knew that the next time it broke, the law would be the one coming through the door. I was ready to pack my bags, but the only thing I was taking with me was my dignity. The audit was closed, and the debt was about to be collected in full. The light of the morning was a thin gray line on the horizon when the sound finally came. It was the sound of a heavy hand striking the solid oak of my front door. I did not jump, and I did not flinch. I had been sitting in my armchair by the window for 3 hours watching the shadows pull away from the trees. I stood up and smoothed the wrinkles in my robe. I felt a strange sense of calm as I walked toward the hallway. This was the moment Sloane had spent weeks building, and it was the moment I had spent a lifetime preparing for. I opened the door and found Sheriff Miller standing there. He looked smaller than he did when we used to play cards at the community center. He was holding a stack of papers, and his uniform looked stiff and uncomfortable in the early morning air. He would not look me in the eye. He looked at the porch light and then at the ground, and I knew that he felt the weight of what he was about to do. I looked past him toward the street. Across the pavement, parked right under the old maple tree, was the white Lexus. Sloane and Kendrick were leaning against the hood. Sloane was wearing a designer coat and holding a cardboard cup of expensive coffee. She was laughing. It was a bright, sharp sound that traveled through the morning air like a needle. Kendrick was standing next to her, and he was trying to smile, but his face was still a mess of bruises from the cartel beating. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw no hesitation in him. He thought the game was over. He thought the house was finally theirs, and the debt was paid, and I was just an obstacle that was about to be cleared away. Sloane raised her coffee cup toward me in a mock toast. She looked like she had already moved the furniture in. She looked like she had already spent the $3 million. I turned back to the sheriff. He cleared his throat and told me that he had an emergency order signed by Judge Harrison. He told me that I had 2 hours to vacate the premises, and that if I did not leave voluntarily, he would have to use force. He said he was sorry, but the law was the law. I reached out and took the papers from his hand. They felt like a death warrant, but I knew they were actually a receipt. I read every word on the first page. I looked at the signature of the corrupt judge and the stamp of the county clerk. I looked at Sloane again. She was whispering something to Kendrick, and they were both looking at the house as if they were measuring it for a new coat of paint. They thought they had used the law to steal a legacy, but they did not realize that the law is a double-edged sword. I felt the cold air in my lungs, and I felt the strength of the Vance name in my blood. I looked at the sheriff, and I did not see an enemy. I saw a man who was about to realize he was on the wrong side of the ledger. I took a deep breath, and I felt the presence of Lorraine behind me. I was 73 years old, and I was standing on my porch with an eviction notice in my hand, but I was the only person on this street who knew that the audit was already finished. I was ready to ask my question. I was ready to end the lie. I stood firm on my property, and I stared at the cold metal of his badge. This was the intersection of every lie they had told and every truth I had found. The dawn was breaking, and the light was finally beginning to reveal the cracks in their perfect plan. It was time to show them that a home is not just a piece of property. It is a fortress. I held the papers between my fingers, and I did not look away from the sheriff. I could hear Sloan laughter from across the street, and it was the sound of a woman who thought she had successfully cheated the universe. I looked at Miller, and I saw the sweat on his upper lip even in the cold. I asked him a very specific question. I asked him if before he made me step off this porch, he had been informed by Judge Harrison about the ongoing federal RICO investigation currently flagged on this exact property title. The sheriff froze. The silence that followed was so absolute that I could hear the wind whistling through the boards over my living room window. Miller did not answer me. He just stared at me as if I had just spoken a language he did not recognize. I told him to turn the papers over. I told him to look at the very back page where the county seal was supposed to be. I told him that the law he was trying to enforce was currently subordinate to a federal whistleblower protection order. The sheriff slowly turned the stack of papers over. His hands were trembling, and the rustle of the paper sounded like dry leaves. He looked at the back of the final page, and his face went from a dull red to a ghostly white in a matter of seconds. Right there, over the top of the county clerk's signature, was a watermark that had not been there when Sloan bought the order. It was a crisp red seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was the mark of the honeypot. It was a formal notice stating that the property at 42 South Street was an active federal crime scene under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice. Miller looked at the seal, and then he looked at the protection order number printed in the margin. He was a veteran of the force, and he knew exactly what that mark meant. It meant that if he moved a single piece of furniture or forced me to leave, he was interfering with a federal investigation. It meant that his local order was nothing more than a scrap of paper in the eyes of the United States government. He looked at me, and his voice was gone. He took 2 steps back off the porch as if the wood was on fire. He told me that he did not know anything about this. He said that the judge had told him it was a standard emergency lockout. He looked at the white Lexus across the street, and then he looked back at me, and I saw the terror in his eyes. He realized that Sloan had used him as a pawn in a federal crime. He turned around and started walking back to his patrol car. He did not even say goodbye. He just wanted to get as far away from that red watermark as possible. I looked across the street at Sloan. The smile was gone. The coffee cup was still in her hand, but it was tilted at a dangerous angle, and the brown liquid was spilling onto her expensive coat. She had seen the sheriff back away. She had seen the way he looked at the papers, and she had seen the way he retreated. She was frozen. The laughter had been replaced by a cold, jagged realization that the dinosaur had bitten back. Kendrick was looking at her and then at me, and he was clearly confused. He did not understand why the sheriff was leaving. He did not understand why the victory had turned into a retreat. I stood there on my porch, and I did not say a word. I just looked at my daughter-in-law. I wanted her to feel the weight of the audit. I wanted her to realize that every bribe she had paid and every lie she had told had been recorded in a ledger that she could not forge. The red seal was the payoff. It was the moment that the truth became more powerful than the fraud. Sloan dropped the coffee cup, and it splashed onto her shoes, but she did not even notice. She was looking at the house, and for the first time she saw it for what it really was. It was not an asset she could liquidate. It was a cage she had built for herself. I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money. I had saved the house, and I had saved the honor of my name. The sheriff reached his car and climbed inside, and a moment later the lights stopped flashing. He drove away, leaving the street in a heavy, suffocating silence. I looked at my son, and I saw the boy he used to be for one fleeting second before the reality of the situation settled back onto his face. Sloan reached for her phone, her fingers moving with a desperate speed, but I knew there was no one she could call who could override the Department of Justice. The checkmate was complete, and the Vance house was still standing. I sat down in my armchair, and I let out a long breath. I was 73 years old, and I had just won the hardest audit of my life. The sheriff's car had barely turned the corner before the silence of the morning became something thick and suffocating. I stood on my porch holding the federal protection papers like a shield, while across the street the world was beginning to fracture for Sloan and Kendrick. The white Lexus was still idling a low mechanical hum that seemed to mock the stillness of the neighborhood. Sloane was standing by the open passenger door, her hands frozen in midair as if she were trying to grab the ghost of the victory she just lost. The coffee she had spilled was a dark stain on the concrete, a perfect map of her failed ambition. Kendrick was looking at her, then back at the empty space where the sheriff had been. He did not understand the watermark. He did not understand that the law had just changed its mind, but he understood the look on Sloane's face. It was the look of a person who had just seen their parachute fail at 10,000 feet. But they were not the only ones watching. A block away, sitting under the shadow of an overgrown oak tree, the black SUV that had been following them for days began to move. It did not crawl, and it did not hesitate. It rolled forward with a predatory intent that made the hair on my arms stand up. The men inside that vehicle were not interested in local judges or county clerks. They had been waiting for the signal that the house was theirs, but they had just witnessed a federal retreat. They knew exactly what that FBI seal meant. It meant the property was no longer a piece of real estate they could flip or hide money in. It was a beacon for the Department of Justice. Their $3 million collateral had just been vaporized by a retired old man with a burner phone. I watched the SUV accelerate. The sound of the engine was a deep, guttural roar that shattered the morning peace. Sloane heard it first. She turned her head, and I saw her eyes go wide with a primal terror that no designer coat could hide. She knew that the sheriff was the only thing standing between her and the consequences of her greed. With him gone, she was just a woman on a sidewalk who owed $3 million to a group of men who did not believe in bankruptcy. Kendrick finally saw the vehicle, too. He moved toward Sloane, his swollen face contorted in a mix of confusion and fear. He still thought they were on the same team. He still thought he was protecting his wife from his father's stubbornness. He did not realize that he was standing next to the person who had handed him over as a secondary guarantor to the devil. The SUV did not stop at the curb. It swerved sharply and blocked the Lexus, pinning it against a fire hydrant with a screech of tires and the crunch of a plastic bumper. The neighborhood was awake now. I saw curtains twitch in the house next door, and a dog started barking a frantic rhythmic sound that felt like an alarm. I stayed exactly where I was. I sat back down in my chair, and I placed my hands on my knees. I was the observer. I was the auditor, watching the final entry being made in a very bloody ledger. I felt a strange, cold detachment. This was the chaos Sloane had invited into my life, and now it was returning to her with interest. She had tried to use the cartel as a weapon against me, but she had forgotten that a weapon has no loyalty. It only cares about who is holding the handle, and right now nobody was holding anything but a losing hand. Sloane reached for her door, trying to get back into the safety of the Lexus, but it was too late. The SUV doors swung open with a synchronized precision that spoke of 1,000 similar hits. I counted 3 men. They were wearing dark tactical jackets and heavy boots that sounded like thunder on the pavement. They did not look like movie villains. They looked like accountants of violence. They moved with a calm, focused energy that was far more terrifying than any scream. They knew that time was short. They knew that the FBI was likely watching through 100 different lenses, but they also knew that in the world of the South Side, a debt must be acknowledged before the law arrives. I saw Kendrick try to step in front of Sloane. It was a pathetic, noble gesture from a man who had already been broken. He raised his hands and started to say something, his voice cracking under the strain of his panic. He was probably trying to tell them it was a mistake or that they just needed more time. He did not understand that time was a currency he had already spent. One of the men did not even slow down. He simply shoved Kendrick aside with a brute force that sent my son sprawling across the hood of his expensive car. Kendrick hit the metal with a loud, hollow bang and slid to the ground, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He looked at me, then he looked at the men, and the look in his eyes was the look of a child who finally realized the dark was full of monsters. Sloane was backed up against the fire hydrant now. Her breathing was coming in short, sharp bursts, and her face was a mask of pure desperation. She was looking for a way out, a lie to tell, a bribe to offer. But these men were not Judge Harrison. They were the muscle of Blackwood Capital, and they were looking at the woman who had lost their money. I watched as the lead man, the one with the scar through his eyebrow, stepped into her personal space. He did not touch her. He just stood there, a dark silhouette against the rising sun. He looked at the house, and then he looked at the papers the sheriff had dropped on the curb. He saw the red watermark. He saw the end of the deal. The air on the street felt like it had been sucked out of a vacuum. The confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. The lead man reached into his jacket and pulled out a handgun. He did not point it at her chest. He held it at his side, a casual display of absolute power. The other two men followed suit, their movements fluid and practiced. They surrounded the Lexus, forming a triangle of steel that trapped Sloan and Kendrick in a space no larger than a coffin. The suburban street with its manicured lawns and white picket fences suddenly felt like a war zone in a distant country. I sat on my porch and I did not reach for my shotgun. I did not call for the police. I had already called the only people who mattered, and I knew they were watching every frame of this through the microphones and the cameras. I was the witness to the final audit. Kendrick was on his knees now, his hands over his head. He was whimpering a sound that I will carry to my grave. He was begging them not to hurt her. He was still trying to be the hero in a story where he was just a footnote. Sloan, on the other hand, had stopped crying. The terror had turned into a sharp, jagged survival instinct. She was looking at the lead man and she started talking a mile a minute. I could not hear every word through the wind, but I heard enough. She was telling them about the offshore accounts. She was telling them that the money was safe and that she just needed 24 hours to move it. She was offering them Kendrick. She was telling them that he was the one who signed the guarantees and that he was the one they should hold accountable. It was the ultimate betrayal. She was throwing her husband to the wolves to save her own skin. The man with the scar did not seem impressed. He looked up at my porch and our eyes met across the 60 feet of pavement. He saw an old man in a robe sitting in an armchair. He saw a man who had outplayed a bank, a judge, and a cartel with nothing but the truth. He did not see a victim. He saw the reason the deal was dead. He raised his gun slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the game I had played. He was not there for me yet. He was there to send a message to the woman who had lied to his bosses. He turned back to Sloan and spoke in a voice that was low and guttural. He told her that Blackwood Capital does not take IOUs from people who are under federal investigation. He told her that she had turned their clean money into a loud neon sign for the FBI. Sloan started to scream, then a high, piercing sound that cut through the morning like a siren. She realized that her beauty and her bank position and her clever lies meant nothing in this moment. She was just a debtor in default. The men began to close in. One of them grabbed Sloan by the arm and jerked her forward, while the other one kept his weapon trained on Kendrick's head. It was a cold, professional kidnapping in broad daylight. They did not care about the neighbors or the cameras. They were moving with the confidence of men who knew the law was 10 minutes away and they only needed 5. I stood up from my chair and walked to the edge of the porch. I did not say a word. I just watched. I wanted Kendrick to see me. I wanted him to see the father he had tried to evict. I wanted him to see the man who had stayed in the house and fought while he had run away and lied. Kendrick looked up and our eyes locked. For a second I saw the boy he used to be. I saw the regret and the shame and the absolute realization of what he had lost. He had traded his father's house for a woman who was currently telling a cartel hitman that he was the one they should kill. It was the most honest moment of his life, and it was the most painful. The lead man looked at me one last time. He seemed to be weighing the risk of coming onto the porch. He saw the federal papers tucked under my arm. He saw the stillness of my house. He knew that the moment he stepped onto my grass, he was no longer a local criminal. He was a federal target. He made the only logical decision an auditor of violence could make. He motioned for his men to pull back. They threw Sloan into the back of the SUV, and Kendrick followed her, a broken man being led to a slaughter. The doors slammed shut with a heavy finality. I stood on my porch and watched as the black SUV sped away, its tires smoking on the asphalt. The white Lexus was left behind, a ghost of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. The street was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of a grave. I went back inside my house and sat down at my kitchen table. I picked up the burner phone and I waited. I knew that the sirens were coming. I knew that the FBI was moving. The wolves had been at the door, but I was the one who had opened it, and I was the only one who had survived the bite. The audit was moving into its final reconciliation, and I was ready to see the numbers hit 0. The morning air on the street was so thin and brittle, I could almost hear the sweat dripping off Kendrick's chin and onto the pavement. The lead man with the scar through his eyebrow did not move an inch. He just stood there with that cold, heavy handgun pointed casually at the ground, but his predatory intent was aimed right at Sloan's throat. She looked at the steel of the weapon, and then she looked at the dark, impenetrable windows of the black SUV, and I saw the exact moment her soul finally exited the building. She did not try to protect Kendrick. She did not reach for his hand or offer him a word of comfort. Instead, she took a frantic and calculated step away from him, as if his very presence was a disease she could no longer afford to be associated with. She raised her voice to a piercing and jagged shriek that made the neighbors' dogs begin to howl in a mournful unison. She pointed a trembling finger at Kendrick and told the men with the guns that they were looking at the wrong person. She screamed that she was just a low-level employee of the bank who had been caught in a trap and that Kendrick was the one who had orchestrated the entire Apex financial scheme from the very beginning. She told them that he was the mastermind who had used his intimate knowledge of my life to facilitate the illegal loans and the synthetic identity fraud. It was a lie so bold and so desperate that even the cartel enforcers seemed to hesitate for a second. She did not stop there. She told them that Kendrick was the one who had forged my signature on the property deed because he was tired of waiting for me to die and wanted to take the money and leave her behind. She offered him up like a piece of spoiled meat to a pack of hungry wolves. She told the man with the scar to take Kendrick and do whatever they needed to do to get their $3 million back. She said she was just a victim of his masculine greed and that she could help them find the hidden offshore accounts if they just let her go. I watched my son's face as he heard these words, and he looked like he had been struck by lightning. He was still on his knees on the cold asphalt, his hands over his head, and he looked up at the white woman he had sacrificed his father for. She would not even look him in the eye. She kept her gaze fixed on the men with the guns bargaining for her life. She was treating him as if he were nothing more than a bad debt she was trying to write off her taxes. I realized then that my audit of her character had been perfect. She did not have a heart or a conscience. She had a balance sheet and a survival instinct that was as sharp as a razor. Kendrick had just moved from the asset column to the liability column in a matter of seconds. She was willing to watch him be dragged into that black SUV and disappeared into the shadows of the South Side forever, if it meant she could keep her freedom and her stolen millions. The lead man with the scar looked at her with a disgust that was almost human. He had seen 1,000 betrayals in his line of work, but this one was a masterpiece of cold-blooded treachery. He saw a woman who had used a man's love to build a fortress and was now using that same man to bait the trap so she could escape the consequences of her own ambition. She was begging them to take him instead. She told them he had the keys to the digital wallets. She told them he was the one who knew the passwords. She was stripping him of his humanity and his protection right in front of his own father's house. The sound of Kendrick's heartbreaking was louder than the idling engine of the Lexus. I watched the light die out of his eyes as he knelt there on the pavement, and it was the most painful entry I have ever had to make in the ledger of my life. He looked at Sloane, and I saw the 48 hours of loyalty he had shown her evaporate into a cold, black void of reality. He finally realized in that one terrible second that the woman he had betrayed his own blood for had never truly loved him. He had been a tool. He had been a convenient signature on a fraudulent page. He had been a shield for her to hide behind while she stole $3 million from a group of people who do not believe in mercy. He looked at his hand at his mother's antique wedding ring that he had given to this monster as a sign of his devotion, and he started to shake with a violence that made his teeth chatter against each other. He looked up at me on the porch, and the shame in his eyes was so heavy it made him sag toward the ground. He had traded 50 years of family history and a father's unconditional love for a woman who was currently telling a cartel hitman to take his life instead of hers. He had stood across the street and laughed while I was being evicted, and now he was the one who was truly homeless in this world. He had no wife. He had no money. He had no dignity. He was just a broken man in an expensive suit waiting for the end to come. I felt a sharp pang of the old love I used to have for him when he was a boy, but I did not move. I could not move. A federal audit has no room for mercy for the person who willingly signs the fraudulent papers. Kendrick had signed every single document. He had validated every one of her lies to the bank and the judge. He had been her most effective weapon against me because he knew my weaknesses better than anyone, and now that weapon was being discarded because it was no longer useful to the owner. He tried to speak, but his voice was a hollow rasp that could not even reach the curb. He asked her how she could say those things. He reminded her that they were supposed to be a team, building a new life together. Sloane did not even flinch at his words. She just told him to shut up and let the professionals handle the negotiation. She was already mentally moving on to her next life and calculating how to get to the airport with her secret accounts. Kendrick's world did not just crumble, it was pulverized by the weight of the truth. He saw the reality of his own life, and it was a barren landscape of his own making. He had built his house on sand, and the tide of his own greed had finally come in to wash it away. He was not a hero, and he was not a success. He was just a fool who had been outplayed by a predator he was not equipped to handle. I watched him bury his face in his hands and start to sob, but it was not the sound of a man in physical pain. It was the sound of the man who had realized he was already dead to everyone who mattered. The cartel men did not care about his tears or his regret. They just saw a debt that needed to be collected one way or another. They moved in closer, and the shadows of the morning felt like they were swallowing the entire suburban street. Kendrick was the one who had brought these wolves to my door. He had invited them into our family history, and now the wolves were hungry for his flesh. I stood on my porch and watched my son fall into the abyss of his own choices. It was the hardest thing I have ever had to do as a father, but it was the only way for the audit to reach its final balance. He had to see the woman for who she really was. He had to feel the cold steel of the betrayal he had practiced on me. The ledger was finally being balanced, and the price of his education was everything he owned. I watched the lead man grab him by the collar, and I did not blink. The truth is a hard thing to swallow, but once the audit starts, there is no way to spit it back out. Kendrick had chosen his side, and now the side he chose was devouring him. I felt the weight of my father's legacy in the wood of the porch, and I knew that the cost of this house was the loss of a son who never really lived here. The audit was entering its final reconciliation. The black SUV was just beginning to pull away when the world turned into a kaleidoscope of blue and red lights. It happened so fast that for a moment I thought my own heart had stopped. The high-pitched scream of the sirens did not come from a distance. It came from right around the corner and from the driveways of 3 houses I had thought were empty. The suburban peace was not just broken, it was shattered into a million pieces. From both ends of the street, 4 massive black vans with tinted windows swerved into the middle of the road, effectively boxing in the cartel SUV and the white Lexus. The sound of tires screeching against the asphalt was like a chorus of dying machines. Before the dust could even settle, the side doors of the van slid open and a sea of dark tactical gear poured out onto the pavement. These were not local patrol officers. These were men and women wearing heavy vests with the bold yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They moved with a synchronized and terrifying grace that made the cartel enforcers look like amateurs. I stood on my porch, and I felt the vibration of their boots in the wood under my feet. It was a rhythmic and heavy thumping that sounded like the hammer of justice finally coming down on a long overdue debt. I saw Agent Miller in the center of the swarm. He was not wearing a suit anymore. He was in a tactical vest with a headset and a sidearm drawn, and his face was a mask of cold professional focus. He was the auditor of the street now. The air was filled with the sharp, authoritative shouts of the agents ordering everyone to get on the ground. The morning sun caught the light on dozens of rifle barrels all pointed at the center of the street. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The predators who had been circling my home were suddenly the ones in the crosshairs. The black SUV tried to lunge forward one last time, but a federal armored vehicle rammed it from the front, pinning it against a tree with a crunch of metal that sounded like a final judgment. The power dynamic of the neighborhood had flipped in the span of 10 seconds. Sloan was standing by the Lexus, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. She looked at the federal agents, and then she looked at the black vans, and she finally realized that the dinosaur had not just bitten back, he had called the entire pack. The tactical team moved with a level of precision that I had only ever seen in the high-stakes audits of international banks. They did not just arrest the suspects, they secured the environment with a clinical efficiency that left no room for error. Every door of every vehicle was searched, and every piece of paper on the street was bagged as evidence. I watched as an agent carefully picked up the limestone rock Sloan had used to mutilate herself. He placed it in a plastic bag and labeled it with a black marker. That rock was no longer a weapon against me, it was a primary exhibit for the prosecution. I saw another agent pulling the laptop bag from the back seat of the Lexus. That machine held the digital soul of the Apex financial fraud, and now it was in the hands of the people who knew exactly how to make it talk. I stayed in my armchair on the porch and watched the light of the morning reveal the truth. The neighborhood was alive with the sound of radios and the low hum of the tactical vehicles. It was a symphony of order rising out of the chaos Sloan had created. The lead cartel enforcer, the one with the scar through his eyebrow, was the first to realize that his luck had run out. He was a professional, and he knew that you do not fight a federal tactical team in the middle of a residential cul-de-sac. He slowly raised his hands and dropped his heavy handgun onto the pavement with a dull metallic clatter. His men followed suit, their faces empty of the bravado they had shown just moments ago. They were forced to the ground, their faces pressed into the same asphalt where they had just beaten my son. But the real satisfaction came when the agents moved toward Sloan. She did not go quietly. She tried to spin a new lie even as the rifles were aimed at her chest. She started screaming about her rights and her position at the bank. She tried to run toward the Lexus, but an agent who looked half her age and twice as strong intercepted her with a movement that was too fast for the eye to follow. He did not hesitate. He tackled her right onto the lawn she had been trying to steal. I watched her expensive designer coat get stained with the dirt of my yard. I watched her face hit the grass, and for the first time I saw her in handcuffs. The sound of the ratcheting metal was the most satisfying music I have ever heard. Miller stood over her and read the charges in a voice that was as dry as bone and as cold as a grave. He spoke of wire fraud and identity theft and the RICO violations that would keep her in a federal cell until she was an old woman. He talked about the $3 million and the forged deed and the medical power of attorney. Each word was a nail in the coffin of her ambition. Sloan was sobbing now, but they were not the tears of a victim. They were the tears of a predator who had been outplayed and trapped in a cage of her own making. Kendrick was being handcuffed, too. He was sitting on this curb, his head between his knees, weeping with a shame that I hope stays with him for every day of his life. He was an accomplice by signature and an accomplice by silence, and the law did not care about his regret. The agents did not treat him with any extra kindness just because he was my blood. To them, he was just another entry in a criminal ledger that needed to be balanced. I saw them lead him to a separate van, and he looked so small and broken between the two large federal agents. He looked back at me one last time, and I saw the absolute ruin of our family in his gaze. He had lost everything for a lie. He had traded his heritage for a mirage of wealth, and now he was going to spend his prime years in a federal facility explaining his choices to a judge who would not care about his excuses. I stood on my porch and I looked at my house. The federal agents were everywhere, and the yellow crime scene tape was being unrolled across my front gate, but for the first time in years the air felt clean. The audit was not just about the money anymore. It was about the truth, and the truth was finally standing tall on the south side. Sloan was being lifted off the ground, her face smeared with mud and grass and her hair a tangled mess. She looked at me on the porch, and the mask was completely gone. There was no smirk and there was no clever retort. There was only a hollow and broken woman who had finally realized that she had underestimated a man she thought was a relic. I did not look away. I wanted her to see my eyes. I wanted her to know that I was the one who had invited the cavalry to my own front door. I wanted her to understand that a 73-year-old man is not a target. He is a survivor who knows how to count. The cartel enforcers were being processed with a cold and professional efficiency that left them with no dignity. They were the muscle that Sloan had thought she could control, but they were just another variable that had been accounted for in the federal audit. Agent Miller walked up the steps of my porch and stood next to me. He took off his tactical helmet and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at the street filled with agents and vehicles, and then he looked at me. He did not say good job, and he did not offer a celebratory handshake. He just said the property is secure and the suspects are in custody. He told me that the audit was officially moving into the prosecution phase. I thanked him and told him that I was going to go inside and make a pot of coffee. I told him that the house felt like it belonged to me again. He nodded once and went back down the steps to manage the final details of the scene. I stayed on the porch for a long minute watching the blue and red lights reflect in the windows of the houses across the street. The wolves were gone and the predators were in cages. The Vance house was still standing and the ledger was finally balanced. I felt 73 years of history in my bones, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally rest. The audit was closed. The sirens eventually stopped, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was the heavy silence of a battlefield after the smoke has cleared and the soldiers have been marched away. My neighborhood in the South Side went back to its slow and predictable rhythm, but the energy around 42 South Street was forever altered. I spent the next few months watching the legal machine grind Sloan into dust. Agent Miller stayed in touch, and every phone call was another piece of the ledger falling into place. The federal government does not act with the hesitation of a local civil court. When they move with the weight of 1,000 years of law. Sloan was not just a prisoner, she was a case study in the absolute destruction of a corporate predator. They systematically dismantled the entire infrastructure of Apex Financial. They seized every computer and every server and every file that held the secrets of her synthetic identity ring. They tracked the outbound transfers to the offshore accounts and the encrypted wallets, and they froze every cent she had tried to hide. It turns out that when you steal from the elderly and the vulnerable, the government takes it very personally. The forensic audit of her bank accounts revealed a level of greed that even I found shocking. She had been draining her own clients and skimming from the high-interest loans she facilitated for the cartel. Every asset she thought she owned was seized. Her luxury condo downtown was forfeited and her white Lexus was sold at a government auction. The designer clothes and the jewelry she had worn like armor were bagged and tagged as proceeds of crime. Sloan is currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting transfer to a maximum security prison. She was found guilty of over 40 counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and RICO violations. The judge did not show an ounce of mercy. He looked at the video of her hitting herself with a rock, and he called her a danger to the fabric of society. She is facing a mandatory sentence of 30 years. By the time she sees the outside of a fence, She will be an old woman with nothing but the memory of a house she never owned. Kendrick was not the mastermind, but the law does not care if you were just following orders when you sign your name to a forgery. He was not sent to a high-security prison, but his life was effectively over the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. The federal agents allowed him to plead down to a lesser charge because he agreed to testify against the cartel, but the price was his entire future. Because he had signed the guarantor papers for the $3 million loan, he was legally responsible for the debt, even if the money was stolen by Sloan. His credit score was deleted from existence. No bank will ever lend him $1, and no reputable company will ever hire a man with a federal fraud conviction. He lost his wife before the first court date. Sloan lawyers filed for divorce from her cell, claiming that Kendrick was the one who had forced her into the criminal lifestyle. She tried to use him as her final escape hatch, but this time the lie did not stick. Kendrick was left with absolutely nothing. No home because his condo was seized, no money because his accounts were frozen, and no dignity because the entire city had seen the footage of his cowardice. He was a man who had traded his father's soul for a seat at a table that was never meant for him. Now he was just a ghost wandering the streets of a city that had moved on without him. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when I heard the sound of footsteps on my porch. I was sitting in my library with a book of old blueprints, and the house felt warmer than it had in years. I knew that rhythm of the walk. It was the walk of a man who had run out of places to hide. I walked to the front door and I opened it. Kendrick was standing there in the rain, and he looked like a man who had been discarded by the world. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by a cheap hoodie and jeans that were 2 sizes too big. His face was thin, and his eyes were sunken back into his head. He looked at me, and for a long minute, he did not say anything. Then he collapsed. He did not just fall, he crumbled onto the wood of the porch. He started to sob, a deep and desperate sound that echoed through the quiet street. He crawled toward me on his hands and knees, reaching out to grab the edge of my trousers. He started to beg. He told me that he had made a terrible mistake. He said that Sloan had manipulated him and that he was confused and scared. He told me that he had nowhere to go and that no one would give him a job or a room to stay in. He reminded me that he was my only son. He asked me for one more chance to prove that he could be the man I wanted him to be. He promised to spend the rest of his life making it up to me. He said he would fix the windows and paint the house and do whatever I asked if I would just let him back inside. He was weeping into the fabric of my clothes, and for a second I felt the ghost of the man I used to be, wanting to reach down and pull him up. I wanted to believe that the boy who used to play t-ball was still in there somewhere. But then I looked at his hands. I saw the empty space on his finger where Lorraine ring used to be. I remembered the night he came into this house and told me to leave so he would not be killed. I remembered the way he laughed across the street while the sheriff was at my door. I realized that the man on my porch was not a son who had lost his way. He was a predator who had failed. He was only here because he had run out of other options. If Sloan had succeeded, he would be sitting in a mansion right now, and he would not have given me a second thought. His tears were not for the pain he caused me. They were for the pain he was feeling because he was finally facing the consequences of his own choices. A forensic audit does not have room for emotional appeals. It only looks at the facts. And the facts were that this man had tried to bury me alive. I looked down at him and I felt a profound sense of clarity. I told him that I had already forgiven him in my own heart because carrying the anger was a debt I did not want to pay. But I also told him that forgiveness and trust are 2 very different ledgers. I told him that the house at 42 South Street was no longer his home. It was my sanctuary. I had fought for this ground, and I had won it with the truth. I told him that he had chosen his side when he stood with Sloan, and now he had to live with that decision. I gently reached down, and I pried his fingers off my clothes. He looked up at me with a look of pure desperation, but I did not blink. I stood up straight, and I stepped back into the hallway. I took hold of the heavy oak door, and I looked at him one last time. I saw the ruin of a legacy that he had tried to burn down. I pulled the door shut, and the sound of the latch was the final period at the end of a long and painful sentence. I turned the deadbolt, and I heard the mechanical click of the security system engaging. I walked back into my library, and I did not look out the window. I did not listen for his shouting or his crying. I sat down in my armchair and I felt the weight of the house around me. It was a good house. It was a strong house. And for the first time in a very long time, it was a quiet house. I was 73 years old, and I had finally learned that the hardest part of an audit is not finding the error. It is having the courage to close the book. The door was locked and my life was finally my own. I turned the page of my book and I did not look back. 6 months have passed since the flashing light stopped reflecting in my windows and the yellow crime scene tape was finally cleared from my front lawn. The neighborhood in the South Side has returned to its steady and predictable rhythm, but the air around 42 South Street feels different now. It feels light. It feels clean. I am sitting on my front porch in the same oak armchair where I once watched the wolves gather in the dark. The morning sun is a gentle warmth on my face, and the steam from my black coffee rises in a perfectly straight line toward a sky that no longer feels like it is falling. I do not have to look over my shoulder anymore. I do not have to check the locks every 20 minutes. The silence of the morning is no longer a heavy burden. It is a privilege I have earned with every ounce of my dignity. I spent the first few weeks after the raid systematically restoring the house to its former glory. The boards are gone from the living room window, and the new glass is so clear it looks like there is nothing between me and the world. I polished the hardwood floors until the grain of the wood glowed like amber. I painted the porch a fresh shade of navy blue, the color Lorraine always said reminded her of the ocean. I moved the furniture back to its original positions, and I cleared out every trace of the people who tried to turn my legacy into a criminal enterprise. The smell of raw wood and expensive bistro food has been replaced by the scent of fresh coffee and the blooming jasmine in my garden. The house feels solid again. It feels like it is anchored deep in the earth by the hands of the man who built it. Agent Miller came by last Tuesday to drop off the final set of papers. He was not in a tactical vest this time. He was wearing an old flannel shirt, and he looked like a man who was ready for his own retirement. We sat in the kitchen and drank coffee out of the ceramic mugs Lorraine bought for our 20th anniversary. He told me that the federal trial was a slaughter. Sloane's lawyers tried every trick in the book to shift the blame, but the forensic audit I provided was an unshakable wall of facts. The judge was particularly disgusted by the video of her hitting herself with the limestone rock. He called it a calculated act of malice that proved she had no soul to save. Sloane was sentenced to 30 years in a federal facility. She is no longer a name that carries any weight in the financial world. She is just a number in a system that does not care about her designer clothes or her offshore accounts. Every penny she stole was seized by the government. Her luxury condo was sold at a public auction, and her white Lexus was towed away to a federal lot. She is left with nothing but the four walls of a cell and the knowledge that she was outplayed by the very man she tried to bury. Miller also told me about the cartel. The information on that clone drive was the key that unlocked a dozen different investigations across 3 states. The Blackwood Capital organization has been dismantled from the top down. Their leaders are facing life sentences, and their enforcers are scattered to the wind. The threat that once loomed over this neighborhood like a dark cloud has been evaporated by the heat of a federal investigation. My house is no longer a target. It is a symbol of a reckoning. Miller thanked me one last time before he left. He told me that in 30 years of service, he had never seen a civilian hold their ground with the level of calm and precision I showed. I told him that an auditor does not get rattled by the numbers. We just wait for the final balance to be struck. I think about Kendrick sometimes, but the pain is no longer a sharp edge. It is a dull and distant ache, like an old injury that only hurts when the weather changes. He is out there somewhere living a life that has been stripped of every luxury he once craved. He is a man with a federal record and a reputation that is beyond repair. I have not spoken to him since that rainy night he crawled onto my porch. I have blocked his number, and I have closed the door to that part of my heart. I realize that you cannot save a man who is willing to burn down his own father's house to keep himself warm. Kendrick was my son by blood, but he became a stranger by choice. I have accepted that the Vance name ends with me, and I am at peace with that. I would rather be the last of an honest line than the beginning of a crooked one. I have made my peace with Lorraine, too. I talk to her in the quiet moments of the evening, and I tell her that the house is safe. I tell her that I kept the ring safe and that the honor of our life together was never compromised. The neighborhood is waking up now. I see the postman walking his route and the kids on their bikes heading toward the park. They do not know about the RICO case or the synthetic identity ring or the cartel enforcers who once stood where they are playing. They just see a 73-year-old man sitting on his porch enjoying the sun. And that is exactly how it should be. The world moves on, and the grass grows back over the scars on the lawn. I take a sip of my coffee, and I feel a profound sense of satisfaction. I am not an old man waiting for the end. I am a man who has successfully finished the most important project of his career. I have accounted for every lie, and I have balanced every debt. The ledger is clean, and the books are closed. The most dangerous mistake you can make is underestimating a man who has nothing left to lose but his dignity. Blood simply means we are related. Loyalty dictates who is family. When the ones you built a foundation for try to bury you under it, let them dig. Give them the shovel. I didn't seek revenge. I orchestrated a reckoning. I let their own arrogance blind them to the trap they were building for themselves. At 73, I learned that true peace is not found in forgiveness. It is found in absolute, unapologetic justice. Let the wolves eat each other. If this story reminded you that your dignity is worth more than any price, then please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I want to hear your thoughts on Terrence's decision in the comments below. Was he right to close the door on his son, or should he have given him one last chance? Let me know where you are watching from, and share this story with someone who needs to hear that the truth always wins in the end. Thank you for being part of this journey, and I will see you in the next story of the South Side.